Analysis and Science Application Group, Assistance Group in Fort Collins. And it's sort of a national center for social science and social science dimensions and applications for Department of Interior. It's really great. And with her, Nina Buchart, who's also a research scientist there in Fort Collins. So the four of us have organized this breakout group, and as Shannon indicated, it's part of an ongoing effort to really develop a network of practitioners dealing with adaptation planning to deal with natural resource issues within a region that covers quite a diversity of interest. It's a 7-state area that covers Colorado, Kansas, Wyoming, Nebraska, Montana, North and South Dakota. And so it really covers, sort of the Continental Divide, the Rocky Mountains, all the way into the plains. And if you think of the Missouri River Basin, with the Platte coming up from the south, Rocky Mountain National Park, and the upper Missouri coming out of Montana, Yellowstone, or actually Glacier, you really start seeing the two arms of a very large system that covers forest systems, these headwaters of incredible water resources, looking at agriculture, rangelands, urban development, and tourism, really being part of the region that we have in our domain. And we're looking at supporting climate science research, both on looking at what we understand about climate and its impacts on natural resources, on different sectors. And then what Shannon and I are leading up is an effort to really look at how do we actually understand the socio-ecological framing of these management questions in light of changing climate, and changing land use, changing social economic dimensions, and how do we embed more and incorporate more in an integrated way the social science dimensions. And so that's, again, where Rudy and Nina from that policy analysis and science assistance group really brings in some of the ongoing efforts within the USGS to look at social science issues related to natural resources, in particular looking at vulnerability assessments and adaptation efforts. So these are things that we're really aiming to work with our USGS partners and other DOI management entities with a collection of 9 universities, which comprise the University Consortium of the National or North Central Climate Science Center. And with that breadth of universities across the region, which includes 3 here in Colorado, and University of Wyoming, Montana State University, University of Nebraska-Lincoln, Kansas State University, really cover a breadth of engagement with various stakeholders. And we're really using that effort as well as with the USGS partnerships to bring communities of practice together, to really start sharing their knowledge and expertise in how they're approaching issues related to how do we manage for climate change across these really complex issues of water, wildlife conservation, energy and land use changes that we're confronted with. And so we're as Shannon indicated, we're initiating this sort of working group within the Climate Science Center, one of sort of 3 focus areas of effort, the other 2 being understanding climate change within the region and climate dynamics that embraces our region, and looking at the impacts of climate change on our natural resources, on the wildlife issues related to energy, land, and water, and the biodiversity within our region. But this effort of really trying to engage in a framing of the social ecological system and really trying to look at this as a very integrative problem, that how can we actually understand the various aspects of adaptive capacity in that framework of a social ecological system. Really understanding some of the institutional barriers, looking at some of the opportunities related to development, looking at livelihoods, and seeing how then that is incorporated within the challenges of the changing precipitation and temperature patterns affecting the seasonality of many of our ecosystems, looking at water challenges related to a variety of uses and competing uses. We're working in partnership with a number of NGOs as well, and through our efforts in the Climate Science Center, we're looking at partnerships of agencies, both federal and state, incorporation in research activities related to tribal communities and tribal governments, and NGOs, to really try and bring in this variety, this rich tapestry of research and application of this research to solving problems related to planning for adaptation to climate change in our region. So this is really a great forum to have this initial discussion with our some of our experts from the region itself, but also to have a broader discussion with other researchers and practitioners throughout the nation, and really see that this is really a need for a collaborative and community effort to really move forward in developing sort of some common guidelines for developing and co-developing this adaptation strategies for dealing with natural resources, and looking then at developing case studies to where we can actually learn from these various activities. In today's presentations that we'll be hearing from some of the efforts from Rudy Schuster, from Betsy Neely, from Shannon McNeely, about some of the things that they have done to help us move forward in formulating sort of our view of how we actually incorporate social ecological systems into this planning process, and the engagement with the management entities and managers within our region and across the nation, really, because a lot of these issues we share with other regions across the U.S. As well. And so with that, what I'd like to do, maybe starting with Shannon and go around this table and then back to the room, and just sort of have folks just kind of introduce themselves and indicate, where they're from, what sort of background that they have. And hopefully the microphone here on the computer will capture a lot of this. So if you can, just for the sake of our participants that are virtually here, if you could speak up, that'd be great.
I'm going to stand over here and actually ask the folks who are online to start introducing themselves so we know who's there virtually. So Jeff Morissette is on the line. He's our director, our USGS director of the North Central Climate Science Center. So Jeff, if you want to just introduce yourself real quickly. You might be muted.
Yep, I am on mute, so there might be a little bit of a delay. But can you hear me now?
Yep, we can hear you.
Okay, I am hearing a little echo, but that's okay. So I'm Morissette with the U.S. Geological Survey in Fort Collins, on sequestered non-travel status with all the other USGS people. Would love to be there. But Dennis covered with the North Central Climate Science Center is doing very well. Him and Shannon, I think he got us covered, and I'm looking forward to listening in on the conversation. Looking forward to seeing what comes of it.
Great. And Rudy and Nina.
Can you guys hear us now?
We can.
Shannon?
Yep, we can hear you.
Okay, good. So, sorry for feedback if it happens here. Rudy Schuster with the USGS, as Dennis said, sort of the branch chief of the Policy Analysis Science Assistance branch here in the Fort Collins Science Center. We're a group of social scientists, as Dennis said, who conduct a variety of social and economic sort of research projects to facilitate the information needs of various public land management agencies.
Hi, this is Nina Burkhart, and I am also up in Fort Collins, USGS, with the PASA group. And I'm a political scientist by training, and I'm pretty interested in things like institutional adaptation to climate change. I'm also pretty interested in negotiation and conflict resolution, so have some interest in looking at how those things play into some of those institutional changes.
Okay, and I saw that Nick joined us. Nick, if you're able to hear us and us to hear you, you want to introduce yourself? You might be muted. Maybe it's not working for you. Is anybody else on? It looks like we have a couple other people who might be on the line. Unfortunately, I can't see names.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Can you hear us?
Oh, yeah, yes, I can. This is Karen Blakeney. I'm the National Climate Change Coordinator for BLM in Washington. And I'm also working with Rudy on the HDCC project.
Oh, great. Thank you. The HDCC is the Interagency Human Dimensions of Climate Change Working Group that Rudy's going to present after my presentation. Great. Thanks, Karen. Thanks for joining us. Is there anybody else on the line who hasn't introduced themselves? Going once. Going twice. All right.
Hi, this is Nick Fezzachelli.
Hi, Nick. Go ahead.
Okay. So I'm Nick Fezzachelli. I'm an ecologist with the Climate Change Response Program with the National Park Service in Fort Collins. And I work on various climate change adaptation issues, looking at planning as well as vulnerability assessment, scenario planning, those types of projects.
Great, thank you. Thanks for joining us today. And I think that might be it. Is there one more person who hasn't introduced themselves? John Gross just arrived. John, are you hearing us? Can we hear you? You might be muted. John, is that you?
Okay.
Hi, John.
Hi. Yeah, I'm late too.
That's okay. We're just going around and doing introductions. We have Jeff Morissette, Rudy Schuster, Nina Burkhardt, Karen Blakeney, and Nick. I can never pronounce your last name. How do you pronounce your last name? Fizzelli? Is that right? Fizzelli?
It's Fezzachelli.
Fizzachelli. Thank you. And John, if you could just introduce yourself really quickly.
Yeah, can you hear me?
We can.
Oh, that's scary. Okay. Yes, I'm John Gross. I'm with the Park Service in Fort Collins with the Inventory Monitoring Program and the Climate Change Response Program.
Great. Thanks for joining us, John. All right, I'm going to let people go around the room and introduce themselves. I'll introduce myself quickly. I'm Shannon McNeely. I'm an integrated social natural scientist by training, but my focus is on human dimensions of social ecological systems. I just started at the North Central Climate Science Center as an adaptation fellow in October, and again, as Dennis mentioned, I was hired to, in part at least, to help develop the adaptation track and this working group in particular of our CSC efforts. And I'll be presenting. Did you have anything else to present, or am I up next? Okay, great. And just to also really quickly, before I get to the rest of the group, let you guys know, we do have this ongoing working group. We've got several members here at this front table. We are having an all-day workshop on Friday, the 5th, at CSU, and that's going to be basically a continuation of this sort of ongoing dialogue of this working group that we started in January. So there will be some overlap in terms of who is in attendance and who is in presenting in some of the presentation, but Friday is going to be much deeper, sort of digging into really helping us as the Climate Science Center synthesize efforts that are in our region and develop basically a working plan, a research agenda for this adaptation track for the center. So just to sort of give you that context of the working group. And now I'm going to let the room introduce themselves. I'm going to experiment and flip this laptop around, and hopefully you guys can hear that are joining virtually. But if not, just please be patient until we get through the introductions, and we'll do the best we can. So if we want to start over here, Betsy.
Steve Hadley, a conservation planner with the Nature Conservancy, and have been facilitating the Madison Climate Working Group. You'll get to hear a little bit more about that, so that's all I'm saying right now.
I'm Ron, I'm the Secretary of the Intertribal Council and Utility Policy. I've also been the co-chair of Native People, Native Homelands, climate workshops for tribes engaged with climate issues and weather extremes, working on the Great Plains Adaptation piece as well as the tribal chapter of the national system.
Shannon, this is Rudy, and we're not going to really hear what folks are saying, so it might be just easier for you just to let them introduce themselves, and then maybe you just repeat their name so we can write it down and catch it.
Okay, I'll do that. Good idea.
Thank you very much.
So far, if you didn't hear that, it's been Betsy Neely from the Nature Conservancy, Bob Goff from Intertribal Coup.
And I'm trying to work with them looking at that's after community recreation case study that I'm trying to get the work and talk about all their.
So that was Karina Wyborn from University of Montana.
And I'm Dan Williams with the Forest Service Recommended Research Station. For some reasons, we are allowed to travel, unlike other vets for some reason. But anyway, Karina described a lot of what work we've got going on. Anyway, we have this project looking at social vulnerability and family capacity. And there's also a working group, I should mention, within the Forest Service is also looking at this, not just our specific project. So we can help coordinate some of the working groups and some of the other research units.
So that was Dan Williams from Forest Service, one of the lucky few feds able to actually attend the National Adaptation Forum. Glad you can make it, Dan. And in the back.
I'm Pat Comer. I'm chief ecologist for NatureServe. I'm based right up the road in Boulder, and I do a lot working with vulnerability assessments and adaptation strategy development. Mainly with ecosystems.
So that was Pat Coburn?
Comer.
Comer with NatureServe in Boulder.
Programs, WCS is not going to be able to program as climate change adaptation coordinator, and I'm working on climate change adaptation planning and emerging landscapes across this climate science in the central region, as well as other landscapes across North America. And I'm also looking at how we bring together climate science and health. Mostly working with conservation organizations and public agencies, basically
Great, thanks, Molly. So that was Molly Cross with Wildlife Conservation Society in Bozeman, Montana.
On the research side, I mostly read all the conservation research departments, mostly plant conservation work. But I also have class with interpretive climate science for climate change for our communication program as well.
Great, thanks for joining us. So that's Becky Cahoe, K-A-O, from Denver Botanic Gardens. Great.
Use local impacts to elevate the conversation about action. Several meetings, including
Great, thanks for joining us. So that was Adam Markham, formerly with Clean Air, Cool Climate, now at Union of Concerned Scientists. Thank you. Oh, great. You said he's worked with Native Energy with Bob Goff in the past. All right, Dave. If you wanna...
I'm Dave Anderson. I'm director of the Power National Heritage Program, also on the steering committee for Southern Arkansas CC. So our staff has been involved in in climate change and vulnerability assessment and supporting the development of adaptation strategies. Most recently with Adaptation and climate change. Working group, also having a nature serve all these things. And I should write to go a little widely to share what you guys try to do and consider it. And looking forward to learning more about it.
Great, thanks. That was David Anderson from the Colorado Natural Heritage Program, and he's also on the steering committee for the Southern Rockies LCC. Great. Oh. Great. So we should definitely stay in touch to at least keep up to date on your efforts. So that was Mark McGallis from EPA, and he is about to be launching a series of North Central Region webinars on adaptation planning, and he's also working on an adaptation and mitigation plan for the Southern Pine Resource. Great. Thank you.
My name is Stanford. I'm also a scientist. I'm primarily focusing on impacts in this region. Very early on in our study process, as mentioned, reach out to the researcher. Also, I've been forward for 15 years as a plant scientist. During that time, I did a lot of people at restoration work in Colorado and Wyoming. And also did a lot of public lands work, mainly wilderness and roads, area. So I have some knowledge of what the region is facing, some of the management issues, and also I'll be doing that here in July. So I'll have even more of that interest.
Great. So that was Todd Sanford, also with Union of Concerned Scientists.
Oh, yeah, so it's, we're also in an effort to, basically we're undergoing efforts to sort of scope the science around the region. So what are the impacts of what are the connections to climate, what are the other stressors? So as a way to sort of get us up to speed on things, we're holding an expert summit on Friday in Denver. So we've gathered a handful of scientists, academia, and NGOs, and we've invited them to get this workshop on Friday. Really, this is an effort for us to try to build up our understanding of the science around climate impacts. So we're looking to use that as we talk about expand agility there. I think they can actually choose the one that originally recommended we reach out to.
Great.
That's all I have. Thanks for your time. I'm Bill Taylor. I'm the Science Division of Water, and I'm the National Flood Insurance Program Coordinator for my state. We deal with mitigation and looking at trying to get techniques and ways that use adaptation in Kentucky and just what
Great, thanks. So that was Noah Taylor. I spelled it N-O-A-A like the agency. From the Kentucky Division of Water, and he's also the National Flood Insurance Coordinator for his area. Thank you. And John.
I'm John Muir. I'm at the University of Colorado Institute of Behavioral Science, which is pretty broadly based group. I've been an outlier. I've been working for a number of years on agricultural sustainability issues, which came out of learning the hard way, I think, through an awful lot of field communities. But resolving the agricultural water transfer problems is necessary by conservation for the sustaining of the rivers as a small lag. There's such a more moment in this.
concerned after the events of the year 2002 is the really underappreciated problems of range management and its relationship to food production, ranking, and improved economic spaces, job spaces. That in mind, it's inclusive, and we are looking at a really major set of threats to not only agricultural productivity, but also the exports of resources. I'm hoping to work with people on this.
Great, thanks. So that was John Weiner from the University of Colorado Boulder at the Institute of Behavioral Sciences.
So before we have Shannon to kick off with the first sort of presentation, I just wanted to sort of really emphasize that this is part of a participatory activity that we really like to have you, as things emerge, share what you have on your minds and your experiences. There's a really nice cross-cutting set of expertise here and experience that in a way that we want to really try to capture that. And not only what we do at the North Central Climate Science Center, but what you do with your own institutions, and really try to help facilitate this type of collaborative effort across the region and throughout the nation. And it's really going to take that. So, as we go through these things, if there are issues, ideas, this is a fairly small informal group. So please share what you have, ask questions for clarity throughout this. And then as we have an introduction for Shannon, I've sort of interacted with Shannon over the last several years and been impressed with her integrative knowledge of social ecological systems, in particular in Western issues. I had the pleasure of bringing Shannon on as we developed the Great Plains North, the National Climate Assessment efforts for the Great Plains, and she really helped pull that together with our team in Fort Collins. And so we were fortunate enough then to bring her on as a fellow to work on this adaptation, really try to bring more of the social science dimensions to the type of issues that we are dealing with in the natural resource area. Many of the adaptation plans that you see out there are really ecological, environmentally oriented. In my experience in working in this arena, it's really the social dimensions and really gaining a better understanding of how those interplays between society and livelihoods to the management interventions that we come up with from the research community. How do we really get those to take action and to be actionable? And it's really sort of with that in mind that I think we brought Shannon on, and really pleased for her to share that knowledge with you with some of the examples here in Colorado. So I'll turn it over to Shannon. But as I said, this is a very open dialogue, so please speak up.
Great, thank you, Dennis, and thank you everyone for your patience with our sequester / technological challenges today. But so far, so good. Hopefully everybody on the computer is still okay. If I don't hear otherwise, I'll assume you guys are good. So Dennis asked me to talk about a few different things today. So really, my talk is going to be in 3 to 4 sections. I'm actually going to start by talking a little bit about the adaptation chapter of the National Climate Assessment. I was a contributing author and workhorse for that for that chapter. By workhorse, I mean we got about 160 technical inputs, and I, along with my colleague Missy Stultz, had to review all of them. We're talking thousands of pages, which was fun and challenging and an amazing learning experience, because I literally got to have this bird's eye view of all the adaptation actions that are going on across the United States. So first I'm going to talk about that and sort of nest what we're doing with the North Central Climate Science Center in that larger context, because Dennis and I both have this national and even global view of what we're doing here with this effort, and really hope to provide some leadership for the National Science Center's efforts in terms of developing the adaptation element of our activities and of the science as a whole, because as Dennis said, there's a real gap between the ecosystems focus of the within our context, the LCCs and the CSCs, and the kind of broader adaptation efforts that are going on in other sectors. So the National Climate Assessment, if you're not familiar with it, was cross-sectoral across water, ag, energy, urban, tribes. What am I missing? Help me out here, guys. Huh? Forestry, thank you, biodiversity, ecosystems, and then there were cross-cutting issues like energy, water, land. There was a rural chapter, so basically my chapter was adaptation, but I also contributed to several other of the chapters, as Dennis mentioned, Great Plains, and a couple others. So what I'm going to do first, and for some reason this isn't cooperating. Sorry, everybody. I don't know why I'm not able to advance the slides for some reason. It's frozen, it looks like. There we go. All right, so what I'm going to do first is I'm going to talk really quickly about the key findings of the adaptation chapter, again, to sort of nest what we're doing here in this broader context. So that for the adaptation chapter, we looked across all sectors, across all scales of governance. So we looked at federal agency activities, states, tribes, local, regional governments, and the private sector. And since there was no formal technical report commissioned by the NACADAC, the Advisory Committee for the National Climate Assessment, we actually basically wrote that as we were writing the synthesis chapter. So that longer version is published in, I think it's still the current issue of the Mitigation and Adaptation Strategies Journal. So if anybody wants that reference, you can talk to me at Spear about them at all. And just for your knowledge, if you don't also know this, the public comment period on the National Climate Assessment is still open through April 12th. So you are encouraged to go on, read the parts that are relevant to your expertise, and comment on what is in those draft chapters, if they're missing anything, if anything's incorrect, anything like that. So we encourage you to do that. So this first part is really wordy because the key messages were very wordy. We had to shove a lot of stuff into, they wanted us to do 3 or 4 key messages, but we were stubborn and we came up with 6. So the first one is basically that there's a lot of adaptation planning happening across public and private sectors at all levels of government. However, among those activities that are being planned, relatively few are actually being implemented. So this is a really big issue for adaptation across the country. Part of the reason is because there are a lot of barriers to implementation. And so we have a section on barriers, and I list a couple of, well, we list a couple of them here in the draft key findings, but I'm going to go through them quickly through the table in a minute. But there's a real issue of, a lot of interest, a lot of new interest in adaptation, especially since the Secretarial Order of 2009 that established a lot of the federal efforts for adaptation. But there's a real challenge in implementing those efforts, not least of which all the budget issues and economic issues that we've been experiencing in this country. So the third key finding is that there's really no one-size-all adaptations, but there are similarities across regions and sectors, and so sharing best practices, lessons learned, learning by doing, iterative and collaborative processes, including stakeholder involvement, can support the progress. So this is really the spirit with which we're operating for the North Central Climate Science Center, really trying to understand what's out there so far, not just in our region, but nationally, that we can try and implement in our region. And one of the things that we found striking in the technical reports for the adaptation chapter was that so much of what was written about on adaptation really was done in a participatory effort across agencies, across levels of governance. So everyone that wrote about adaptation really emphasized that really important process of adaptation, research, and planning, which is the participatory aspect of it. So climate change adaptation is often done not in name, but in an effort to integrate or mainstream it into other ongoing planning efforts. And in fact, increasingly we're discovering that's the most effective way to do adaptation planning, is to get it into existing efforts, especially for a lot of these practitioners and planners who just don't have the time to do a separate adaptation plan. So this issue of really integrating it to fulfill sustainability goals, to fill disaster risk reduction goals, water resource management is a really key understanding. And in fact, my research in the Yampa White Basin that I'm going to talk about later is in the spirit of that, is looking at a process of which climate is a part, but not necessarily explicitly named climate adaptation. So our fifth key finding was really about the multiple stressors aspect of climate change, vulnerability and risk, and that in order to really understand adaptation, vulnerability, and adaptation of social ecological systems, it requires this, integrated, multidisciplinary, transdisciplinary, interdisciplinary, depending on which word of the day you're using and how you're approaching the project, to understand these integrated social ecological dynamics and the trade-offs of cost, benefits, and risks of available options. And lastly, because adaptation planning and implementation is so nascent in this country and really in the world, because I've also been doing a study with the Global Environmental Facility looking at adaptations across the globe that have been funded by the GEF. We're not alone in the U.S. in terms of the nascent phase of adaptation. Partly that's because so much of the emphasis was on mitigation in the early stages. Part of it is because we are adapting as a society. We are coming to terms with the fact that we need to do something to deal with the impacts of this problem. So with that, there hasn't been a lot of evaluation of adaptation. And so there's some efforts going on. In fact, as part of the National Climate Assessment, they have an indicators development project. There's a meeting tomorrow morning about that, a working group meeting during this time, to really try and develop indicators across climate impacts and specifically for adaptation, which is no small feat. So there's a big section on the federal actions that are going on for adaptation. I encourage you to read that. I'm going to skip over that right now and talk a little bit about more of the state and local level, because that's where a lot of the action is really happening in terms of on-the-ground adaptation, planning and implementation where it does exist. So this was a plan, a map that we used from the Center for Climate and Energy Solutions. This map, I believe, is still up to date, that reflects state adaptation plans throughout the country. And you'll notice in this region, it's quite white, meaning there are no state adaptation plans. And Colorado is a shade of tan yellow because under Governor Ritter, the former governor, a lot was happening in terms of really trying to assess and implement adaptation, but with Governor Hickenlooper's administration, that has been somewhat stalled. Although there is an effort going on right now that Dennis is part of to really try and work with the state to get some sort of statewide vulnerability analysis for the state of Colorado. Actually, Kristen Averett just joined us. She could probably speak better to it because it's really been a partnership with Western Water Assessment and the Colorado Conservation Board. Hey, Kristen, can you hear us? Can we hear you? Kristen Averett. Sorry to put you on the spot right when you get there. If you are able to try, is that you?
Yes.
Hi. Thanks for joining us. So I'm talking about the National Climate Assessment, and can you see my screen?
Yes.
So I'm talking about state adaptation plans and how under Governor Ritter's administration there was some activity that started with you guys at the Western Water Assessment to develop some climate adaptation and vulnerability assessment and implementation, and there was just a question from the audience as to why that has been stalled under Governor Hickenlooper. Do you have any insights you could share with the group?
Yeah, actually, so the first two pieces of that report, the first one was a Colorado climate report that was released in 2008. Then in 2011, we completed a report called the Colorado Climate Planning and
Preparedness.
I can't remember. Anyways, those were both under the Ritter administration, but actually we're making progress right now in terms of discussions with Hickenlooper's administration to engage in a statewide adaptation plan that would really be an impacts assessment and hopefully lead into kind of an assessment of adaptive capacity within the state in different sectors.
Great, thanks, Kristen. And just simply speaking, Governor Ritter, I don't know how much you know about Governor Ritter, but energy, renewable energy, reducing greenhouse gas emissions, climate in general was a big agenda item for him. Hickenlooper, not so much. So it's really, you know, this is one of those issues with what happens when you have administration changes. Oh, so Mark Regalis from EPA just said North Carolina's plan has been completed, but it's not allowed to be posted on the state website. And we can all guess what the reasons are for that, given it's North Carolina. So again, back to these barrier issues, you know, the politics, the administration changes, this is one of the things that we face. So just because there's no state adaptation plans in this region doesn't mean nothing's happening. There's actually quite a bit happening. So one of the things that we looked at, oh, and there's the citation at the bottom of the page for the longer article on this work that was published in Mitigation Adaptation Strategies for Global Change. But there are a lot of action is happening at the local and regional level. So, for example, the Western Governors Association, which includes most of the governors from the Great Plains West, has been doing quite a bit to try and plan and implement for climate adaptation, especially in relation to water resource management. We had in the Great Plains technical report for the climate assessment, we had several adaptation examples, and then in the adaptation chapter, I just pulled out a few that we talked about in the Great Plains region. So the Tulsa, Oklahoma one is in our north central region, but this is the way the regions were broken down for the National Climate Assessment. So it's, you know, these different boundaries are a little funky because we have Colorado in our region, but for the National Climate Assessment, it was in the Southwest region. So we had an example for Texas in terms of what the Forest Service is doing with the Department of Interior and the National Association of Foresters for starting to implement these Texas Firewise communities. And then we have an example for Nebraska where they're starting, the USDA and NRCS are starting to work with farmers to implement a no-till process. So on to the barriers issue. As I mentioned, we have a section on barriers in adaptation chapter, and I won't go through all the bullet points here, but you can just see the kind of highlights, which has to do with, you know, obviously uncertainty is a big issue, and sort of fragmentation of jurisdictions and governance and the implications on decision making and policy, lack of resources, as we just talked about. And then the institutional issues where people have institutional constraints to actually integrate climate into their policies or decision practices. Lack of leadership across scales of governance. And lastly, my favorite topic, which is divergent risk perceptions, cultures, and values. And the difficulty of collective management of resources when you've got people who are trying to work together who have really different ideas about how the world works. And frankly, whether or not climate is even a risk, back to the Hickenlooper-Ritter thing, you know, they have really different risk perceptions in terms of how much they think climate change is a risk. We have this issue too in implementing the work that we're doing because we've got our research community within the Climate Science Center Consortium, and then we've got the management community, and they really have different worldviews, and we have to really keep that at the forefront of our brain as we're trying to develop the right science tools and products for managers to use, and working with managers, that's going to play a really important role. So Dennis asked me to also mention there were We had 4 case studies in the adaptation chapter, and I'm going to talk about 2 of them because they relate to our activities at the Climate Science Center. One is this Northwoods, what do they call it? The Climate Change Response Framework that was spearheaded by the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science, the Forest Service, and multiple partners across federal, state, local, tribal entities. And we chose this as a case study for our kind of ecosystems-focused case study because we sort of surveyed a lot of the experts across the country, and this was one that they pointed out that was probably the farthest along in terms of its development for actual implementation. And so if you go to their website, they have a lot of good documentation on their process and their products, one of which is a lessons learned document where they talk about the importance of, collectively defining the purpose and scope of the framework's components early, about beginning projects with a synthesis of existing information to avoid duplicating efforts. Again, what we're trying to do in this phase of the Climate Science, North Central Climate Science Center, recognizing the necessity of effective communication across these people with different goals and disciplinary backgrounds, and things like, the importance of developing a common language when you're doing these interdisciplinary efforts. And again, that's what we're starting to try to do here, is to develop a common language, to develop some common frameworks for how you do this integrated social ecological systems work. They talk about how important social issues are to climate adaptation, and again, they really point out the difference between managers and scientists in terms of their worldviews and how they kind of approach that issue. The other case study that is relevant to our North Central region is NIDIS, the National Integrated Drought Information System. And so the case studies were really meant to provide examples, success stories of examples of how people overcame the barriers that we talked about for implementing these types of projects. So some of the ways that NIDIS really was able to implement this drought information system was through getting the right finances, getting the right institutional partnerships. There was a policy that was implemented nationally for drought mitigation, and they really had good leadership and champions. Roger Pilardi and Don Wilhite at University of Nebraska-Lincoln with the National Drought Mitigation Center. They actually, and Jim Burden, they were actually providing a lot of the leadership. And then they had leadership within government who were able to get the drought bill through the process. And so having those elements line up was really critical to NIDIS's success. And then the bullets on the right are some of the products that they're working on and that they provide drought early warning information, this web-based portal that really integrates data from a lot of different data sources, coordination of federal research, and leveraging partnerships. And their partnerships really span, again, levels of governance with tribes, with state and federal agencies, and so on. And then really showcasing a visual tool that enables their users to be able to visualize drought. So this is the U.S. Drought Monitor that is housed at the National Drought Mitigation Center at University of Nebraska-Lincoln, which of course is in our region. So we're really trying to partner with them and learn from them in terms of the successes that they've been able to implement so far. So I'm going to kind of transition a little bit. So in the National Climate Assessment Adaptation chapter, we have this diagram of the adaptation process, and it's really kind of a typical process of identifying your risks and vulnerabilities, planning and assessing and selecting the options for adaptation, implementation, monitor, evaluation, and revising. And throughout this process, as much as possible, having the right stakeholder engagement. Not everybody, but the right stakeholder engagement, so the key players. So just as a matter of comparison, this Scanning the Horizons document, the Glick et al., that is about climate change and conservation goals, has a very similar process that they outline, much more focused on the ecosystems conservation side of things. In our adaptation chapter, we were really focused on on-the-ground implementation that's already happening, and really heavily on the human dimension side of things. The Scanning the Horizons framework, as we mentioned earlier, is very, very ecosystems focused. So if you can see, they have their, identify conservation targets as their first step, and then this is where they talk about identifying or assessing vulnerability to climate change through sensitivity, exposure, and adaptive capacity. The way this document is written is really focusing on ecosystems. And so, again, what Dennis and I are trying to do through this adaptation working group is really try and bridge between this very ecosystems-focused approach on understanding climate vulnerability and a more integrated social ecological approach that brings in the social sciences. And so then the framework goes through, identifying management options and implementing management options. So, why are we laughing? Oh, is it? Oh, good. Synergies. So Dan and Karina just said they have the same graphic in their presentation. So just to sort of go a little bit further down the path I was just describing, this paper in particular, and there's a lot of literature on this in the kind of more social-oriented vulnerability and adaptive capacity assessment literature, on the differences between outcome vulnerability and contextual vulnerability. And so I see that the Scanning the Horizons approach really is much more focused on this outcome vulnerability. And I think the climate science centers and the LCCs as a whole tend to be much more in this camp, which is you try and get an understanding of the climate in your location. You try and understand what the ecological responses will be given those climate changes, and then that determines your vulnerability. In this context vulnerability approach, it's a much more broadened and integrated approach to understanding these different dimensions, institutional, socioeconomic, technological, and this broader context of the relationship between humans and ecosystems and how climate impacts them, the exposure, the sensitivity of those social ecological systems, and then the possible coping responses and or adaptation. I make that distinction because they're often used interchangeably. Coping response really in our framing has to do more with sort of immediate event-based responses, whereas adaptation has a broader meaning, which is either responding to and or ideally preparing for future consequences and really adapting in preparation for future climate change. So this is a little bit hard to read, but basically this same paper talks about these different types of questions and analysis and the different types of methodologies that are used. What?
I have a question. So Jeff, can you go back a slide?
Yep.
So you're saying A1A is more of the Glick et al. Framework?
Mm-hmm.
But so that's not circular. And
no.
the Glick et al. is circular.
It's not, but sorry, go ahead.
I would argue that the Glick et al. Maybe falls somewhere in between these two.
Yeah, you're probably right. You're probably right. But keep in mind, what this is doing is pulling out that vulnerability assessment component of the Glick et al. So this is really speaking more to this number 2 wedge of the framework and doing vulnerability assessment. And so that's what I'm arguing is that piece follows more this kind of framework in terms of assessing vulnerability, whereas this social ecological systems framework is over here. And again, these are not hard and fast. You're right. It's probably somewhere in the middle. And I think, again, what we're trying to do with the North Central Climate Science Center and hopefully the Climate Science Center and LCC networks as a whole is move somewhere from here to here to have this sort of broader context understanding. Although I would say that that's probably not universally shared, that idea. So we have to be realistic about that. So again, this really has to do with, and to kind of pick up on your point, Jeff, I was going to say there's the outcome sort of approaches on the left, there's the contextual approaches on the right, and I would say we fall somewhere in here, which is, they have scenario-based approaches, they have agent-based modeling, which we've got an agent-based modeler postdoc coming on this summer, looking at multiple stressors, ideally looking at institutions, and down here we have adaptive capacity and capacity building and adaptive management. So Jeff, I think you're right. I think we fall somewhere more in here. I come more from this world, and Dennis, I would say, is somewhere over here, and so we're really trying to figure out how to bridge these approaches. So this is a somewhat typical framework for, again, this sort of integrated social ecological systems. This is based on the familiar Billy Turner et al. In the Proceedings for the National Academy of Sciences 2003 paper. A lot of my colleagues use this framework. This is just a kind of more elegant version that came out in a more recent paper, Sonwa et al., which is really, again, similar frameworks, which is trying to understand the climate exposure. In other words, how are people and ecosystems exposed to climate, the sensitivity, and this, again, is where I think we're really trying to broaden that Scanning the Horizons framework, which is understanding not just the environmental conditions, but also the human conditions. So viewing humans as part of the system, not just what I've observed in a lot of the conservation-focused climate efforts is that when humans are discussed, it's more of the sort of recipient of the science. It's we do the science over here, we do the assessment, and then we need to outreach and educate and communicate with people on our science so that they make better decisions. When in reality, it's much more complicated than that. And what I do and what we're trying to really build is this understanding the system as a whole. And then same with adaptive capacity, not just understanding the adaptive capacity of species or ecosystems or habitat, but understanding the adaptive capacity of humans within that system, because humans are the ones that are making decisions about how to manage those systems. And this is really the framework. In my research, I sort of integrate multiple frameworks, but this is really a foundational framework for me for sort of thinking about how to organize these components of a social ecological system in the context of climate variability and change. So I'm going to shift now to talking about, for just a minute, about one of the efforts that I'm working on for the North Central region, which is really trying to sort of take stock and synthesize the projects that are happening in the North Central region that have a vulnerability and adaptation bent to them. And this is actually, so far I've put 10 projects in here. Several people in this room are represented on this map. And right now this is just showing 3 of them. And so this is actually, I believe, Lisa Dilling's project, who's going to be here at the second half of the morning after the coffee break, and also presenting her research at our workshop in Fort Collins on Friday. She did some interviewing with federal land managers on their adaptation planning and their barriers. This blue circle is my Yampa White Basin's research that I'm going to talk more about in a minute. And this is actually the Gunnison Basin that Betsy Neely is going to talk about after the morning break. So again, I have, and then the purple is representing the Great Plains assessment that Dennis and I have done. So there's a bunch of other projects in here, and I hope to be continuing to add to this database as we move forward in time, so we can really, again, understand what's happening in the region, identify gaps, and build our research agenda on filling the needs and the gaps in the region. So now I'm going to transition into my research a little bit and how I have used the framework that I've described to look at vulnerability around water resource management issues in the Yampa White Basin's region of northwestern Colorado. Can someone give me a time check, because I can't see it on my computer? 25 to 10, so... Okay, so I'm going to have to fly through this because I need to give Rudy some time to present his stuff. Anyway, asking the questions about social ecological system vulnerability and climate variability and change in the Yampa White Basin's region. So from the outstart, I really just wanted to look at, based on recent climate trends and experience, who, what, where, when are the most vulnerable in this region to climate disturbances. And then one thing I wanted to look at in particular as sort of an analog for water scarcity was what were the vulnerabilities and impacts and responses during the very exceptional 2002 drought in the region. What happened on the ground in terms of how the water moved through the system both physically and legally. Because we have to remember in water resource management, water availability is not just a physical entity, it's also a legal entity. And you've got water commissioners and engineers on the ground who are actually moving water around from reservoirs to different users, and that also affects ecosystem health. So this is a really important thing for understanding not just human impacts, but also ecosystem impacts, because how much water in the system impacts the vegetation, it impacts the fish. We've got a stretch of endangered fish in the Yampa River, potentially listed in the White River. So both the physical and legal regulatory aspects of water availability matter. And then I really wanted to know how people responded collectively and without conflict to the 2002 drought, because I had read that in the Yampa Basin they were able to avoid a formal legal call for curtailment of water uses because they were able to use their social capital in the region to negotiate voluntary reductions, voluntary reservoir releases. So I really wanted to understand the dimensions of how that happened. So for the sake of time, I'm actually just going to skip through a lot of this, but just so if you don't know where the Yampa White Basin is, it's in the northwest corner of Colorado. One of the important things to note is that it's very diverse, both ecologically and socially. In the upper part of the basin on the right-hand side of the map, it's an alpine, subalpine forested area mainly. It's politically much more liberal. You've got Steamboat Springs, the ski area over there that they're world-renowned for. Wreck and tourism is a big part of the economy. And then in the western part of the basin, it's more sage steppe habitat and shale desert. So you've got a lot of ranching and you've got a lot of energy extraction. So very different politically, socially, and from an ecosystems perspective in terms of this basin. And one of the things I was looking at that was another part of this research was really trying to understand through the Yampa White Basin Roundtable process how they were negotiating these issues of water resource management and the role that climate was playing in that. Because inevitably, climate variability and change is a big part of water resource management, no matter where you are on the political spectrum. And then also trying to understand, the Yampa in the context of the larger Colorado River Compact, allocation of water rights through the 1922 Compact and subsequent agreements. The Yampa River actually does have an obligation to not deplete. So in other words, in a sense, they have a delivery obligations, which is not, I don't believe, true of the Gunnison River. So you really have to understand this broader context to understand all of these social ecological dimensions. So just to list, I'm not even going to read them because I don't really have a lot of time here, the different pieces of my methodology to understand from this integrated social ecological perspective the vulnerability and adaptive capacity in the region and the adaptation in process, as I call the Basin Roundtable. I interviewed people that represented all of these different interests in the basin, so across state, federal, there's no tribes in the region. They moved them all to Utah, so there's no tribal representatives really in this region. But state parks, federal agencies. Russ George was actually the architect of the House bill that created the Basin Roundtable process. And so I really, again, needed to understand sort of this full dimension of how all these people interact. And then also looking at drought indicators to understand water availability in the region during this drought in particular. The Yampa White Basin has this kind of mythology about it, that they have all this water, they have all this snow, they have no vulnerability, but in fact they're quite vulnerable because they don't have a lot of storage in the basin. And this is a part of the world that is pretty much entirely dependent, aside from a couple of small groundwater near the river, they're really entirely dependent on snowpack, stream flow, and reservoir releases. And so this surface water supply index for Colorado is an indicator of that. And you can see the Yampa White, the higher the number, or the lower, because it's negative, the less stream flow they have. And so the Yampa really does struggle with shortages. And part of the reason that this is important from this larger context perspective is they've got multiple threats that they're facing. One is the population growth on the Front Range. The Yampa White Basin is looked to as a potential transbasin diversion. Two, they have a lot of energy extraction. The Piceance Basin is also in their region. So if and when, some people don't think when, but if oil shale gets developed, they're going to be heavily impacted. And three, they do have this delivery obligation as part of the Colorado River Complex. So if and when there is a call for curtailment from the lower Colorado River, they are going to be impacted by that. And so all of these factors, again, intertwine. And this is the paper I'm working on now. This slide, I don't expect you to be able to read all of it, but this is actually what I presented to the Basin Roundtable in terms of what I learned from them about how this drought manifested throughout the summer of 2002. And they were very, very appreciative of this because, one, they're appreciative that I actually worked with them to understand their vulnerability from their perspective and integrating their local observations and knowledge. And two, surprisingly, despite the fact that there's a lot of social capital in this region, no one had the full story in their mind in terms of what happened in the basin. And part of the story was a water energy nexus story. The thing that makes them the most vulnerable in this region is getting water to the power plants. And that summer, this tri-state power plant, long story short, which is right next to the town of Craig, was calling for water that was going to shut off the city of Craig. And so the city of Craig was in the process of filing to put the first ever call on the river, legal curtailment call on the river. And through a series of events, one of which was it rained in August, they didn't have to put the call on the river. But this was the real story of vulnerability and risk in the region. And so this last slide is really just a visual of, this picture is actually taken from the Nature Conservancy Carpenter Ranch property, so represents the conservation interests. It's actually a working ranch, so the hay represents the ag interest. In the back, that's actually the Hayden coal-fired power plant energy. And if you squint really hard in the way, way back, you can see Steamboat Springs. So again, really trying to understand how these folks, and that's a picture of the Basin Roundtable, which, by the way, not surprisingly, is full of many, many conservatives and climate skeptics. So, you know, really understanding how to work with them on climate science issues, how to understand their reality in terms of drought, and how to acknowledge and honor the fact that they have observations and they have wisdom about their own system. And actually, a lot of their skepticism about climate and climate science and the application of climate science is quite intelligently informed. You know, when it comes to policy and regulations about managing their water resources, the studies on climate science, they know have implications for their basin. And so they actually have an interest in understanding the climate science more. But you have to approach it in the right way with them. And for me, focusing on drought and climate variability was really, really helpful to do that. So I'm going to end it there. I went a little bit long because I had a lot of ground to cover. But I think, what's the time? I will read, how much time did you think you needed to present your stuff? I'm wondering if we should just have questions now and pick you up after the break, or if you want to just...
Either way is fine with me if you guys want to have questions and then a break. I don't know if you're tied to the break schedule for the coffee breaks for the session, for the conference, or whatever you want to do is fine.
Yeah, so I'll just kind of take a poll from you guys. The scheduled break is 10 to 10:30. We're 15 minutes to 10. We're kind of, this is, again, a bit informal and flexible. So what do you guys want in terms of, would you rather have a Q&A now about my work and pick up with Rudy's after? Do people want, how many people feel like they really want the full 10 to 10:30 coffee break? 15 minutes? Okay. So why don't we do, how about a little bit of Q&A now, and then Rudy can go, and then we'll do coffee. And anybody feel free to move in and out and help yourself if you want, but I'll open it up for questions and comments now. Sure.
You work with these conditions, if we have to stakeholders to kind of get this with background?
I did, yeah. I did. You know, since I didn't get to talk about the methodology fully, a lot of, you know, the sort of observation, participant observation methodology is doing just that, going to community events. There's a water forum there in the region that has a lot of public events that I would tag along to and talk to people, and you know, they would have dialogue with whoever the experts were for the forum. I lived in Simba for a couple months, and through that, you know, did a lot of public sort of interactions and things like that. So I did engage with the public quite a bit, but my focus was much more on the kind of leadership and water resource management decision makers.
Talking about the impacts that access to that with the stakeholders, did you find them thinking that they manage their way out of future problems if they can?
So that's a great question. The question was, in talking to the stakeholders about the 2002 drought, if they are under the impression they can manage their way out of future climate impacts and future drought. I wanted to mention that actually. That's a great question because, for one thing, there was just a report that came out from the Forest Service talking about the fact that probably a lot of the reservoirs aren't going to be able to refill in the future. And we know from long-term, you know, paleo records that drought is, you know, we've been in a relatively wet century, that sort of longer-term chronic drought is much more characteristic of this region. By and large, in answer to your question, the water managers that I talk to feel pretty much across the board, and they know this from experience, they can survive 1 year of 2002-like drought. If they get a back-to-back 2002, so that level of severity. So as you know, a lot of us know, the drought was really for a good portion of the early 2000s. We're now in another sort of round of that. This summer, if there is a exceptional drought in the region, it's going to be really interesting to see what happens because, like I mentioned, they're so dependent on snowpack and stream flow. They're so dependent on the limited storage that they have. The water managers pretty much across the board say we cannot survive a back-to-back 2002 drought. So they're really arguing for more storage in the basin, which of course falls right into conservation issues because, you know, most people in the basin feel like, well, we can't get more storage, partly because of environmental concerns, partly because they have a hard time arguing now that they're going to need the storage in the future because the way that Colorado water law works, you have to be able to show beneficial use. And if you can't show beneficial use for a wet reservoir for the future, it's really, really hard to get that extra storage. And they, in fact, just had a state Supreme Court case that I believe they're in the process of appealing to get another reservoir built high in the basin. So it's a huge concern, not just for the Yamhill Lake Basin, but for pretty much all of the West. Yeah, John.
I want to thank you for working so hard on this and when few academics able to follow these things. I mean, I know it's the first 5 years. But they're coming around to what I think you have helped back in the is that there is no more unaffected environmental processes related to water. I think that's something that natural language are pretty well. There are enormous implications for all of the very ecology and substitute for the most of the science of restoration, for instance, is oriented towards return to natural. Is pretty much irrelevant as soon as it gets to the rest of the world. Even in explorative climates, you have a restoration county with some conditions like that, rare and succession continue. But where we're starting is not only the water conditions and so on. The question is no longer how to use the natural science to say, what do you know about how to interact with human environment,
Yeah, and I don't know how to succinctly summarize what you just said, John, for the people on the web, but basically reiterating the point of working with the Basin Roundtables to help us all collectively understand that the past is no longer a predictor for the future. This idea of kind of, non-stationarity, that the human dimensions is integral to understanding the uncertainty along with the physical uncertainty. Another point I would add is that the Colorado River Water Availability Study, which was a state commission study to look at climate projections for water availability for the Colorado portion of the Upper Colorado Basin, actually had a lot of flaws, but it elucidated a lot of things for the climate skeptics. I've had several of the leadership on the Basin Roundtable say to me, we finally get that 0 might be the number that we're working with in terms of future water availability. We have not been operating under that paradigm. We've been operating under a development paradigm that a lot of these water institutions were set up to use and develop water for human development, and that paradigm is shifting. And a lot of that has to do with the social implications and impacts, but also the climate. And so all of these studies through the Colorado Water Conservation Board, the Western Water Assessment, even the Colorado Water Conservation District, which was the organization set up to advocate for West Slope water interests. In Colorado, of course, we've got this tension between the rapidly developing Front Range and the much more slowly basins of origin on the West Slope, which tend to also be more conservative in political nature. The Colorado River Water Conservation District and the leadership, Eric Kuhn, are really starting to try and get their heads around climate and promote that throughout the West Slope. And so I do think that there's a paradigm shift that's happening. So if you guys don't mind, I'm going to turn the handle over to Rudy, unless there's any other burning questions or comments. Karina had one?
Just go on from that. I mean, it's very similar to the conversations there. It is
Mm-hmm.
65% of that water is and everybody there says climate really is a big deal. I'm like, right now that is a little bit, but it makes no difference. If they take 85% of water.
Yeah, and so Karina is saying that Grand County, where she's been working, they've been advocating for conservation on the Front Range. And 2 points. One is that there is a lot of conservation happening on the Front Range, especially through Denver Water. They've been very proactive. There's probably a lot more they can do, but there has been a lot of action on the Front Range. 2 is the interesting thing about West Slope entities is that they actually have a disincentive to conserve water because they make money off of selling water. And so you've got this kind of paradoxical relationship there. So, but I think through a lot of these adaptations that are happening, bringing Front Range and West Slope people together, there's a lot more of a shared spirit in terms of how do we collectively as a state protect our water and sustain our water. Of course, there's a lot of political stuff that underpins that, but I do think a lot's happening. The global agreement that just happened through Denver Water and a lot of the West Slope entities is an indicator of that.
2 points with regard to tribes in the region. One, tribes may be very much involved in the Colorado call, whether or not and how they're incorporated into the Colorado concept. They may have negotiated their water rights on the state availability in the lake of the Southwest. The tribes in the Great Plains and the Missouri River Basin have, by and large, not established their prior and superior water rights in the winter's time. So that's a wild card out there. So
right.
We're looking at less than 0.
Yeah, I mean that's yes. So Bob Goff was talking about the fact that a lot of the tribal water rights have not been settled, especially in the Great Plains and in the Missouri River Basin, and that's another big wild card in terms of the allocation and use of water if and when the tribes do settle some of those water rights, but most likely they'll be at the short end of that stick. Like they tend to be.
Planning for the Dakotas and Nebraska with regard to the Western governors in terms of energy and water as it's implied in energy, that ends at the boundary between Missouri, Wyoming, and the Dakotas, because all of the Western Governors planning is done through the WEC connection and not anybody east of that continental divide of the power system.
Are you going to talk about that later? Okay, so Bob just talked about the issues in the Dakotas versus the rest of the Missouri Basin and the Plains, and how they're administered as part of the WEC. What does the WEC stand for? Western Electrical Coordinating Council. So again, part of this water energy nexus. So I think we're probably going to have some time for you to present some of this later. So that would be a really good thing to talk about. Rudy, you ready? Do you have a video?
I'm ready, and I was... No, we don't have video, but I was saying, do you guys want to take your break for 15 minutes now while the coffee is fresh and everyone can run out and grab some?
Sure, that sounds good.
Yeah,
All right, so we're going to take a 15-minute break. I'm going to stop the recording for now. All right, so people are going to be trickling back in, but as a matter of time, we're going to go ahead and get started. So again, we're being a little bit flexible with the schedule here. So the way that this is going to go loosely is Rudy's going to talk for about 15 minutes. Then Betsy's going to talk for about 20 minutes on the Gunnison Basin work. Bob Goff is going to talk for about 5 to 10 minutes. Oh, no, sorry, I forgot Lisa Dilling's in there. Lisa Dilling is going to talk for about 5 to 10 minutes to give us a little bit of a debrief on what they did in the RISA session this morning next door, and mention a couple of her projects in the region. Bob Goff's going to talk for about 5 to 10 minutes about tribes, and then Dan and Karina are going to talk for about 5 to 10 minutes on what they're working on, and then we're going to have a group discussion and talk for a little bit about what's going to happen on Friday and get some feedback from you guys in terms of how we're going to structure the afternoon session to make it the most effective for our goals for this endeavor, which is really to identify gaps and needs. And hey, Lisa, would you mind sitting up at this table up here? Because we're going to, when the presentations are done, I'm going to bring the laptop over there so we can have a conversation with the guys on here. They can't hear the room. Yeah, we're using GoToMeeting. So, so I was just giving the breakdown of the schedule. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Rudy now. So Rudy and Nina, if you could maybe help time yourselves and take about 15 minutes to get through your talk, that would be great. And go ahead and introduce yourself again for the group.
Okay, so the room can hear me now?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, great. So I'm going to be talking about the human dimensions of climate change and interagency collaborative. And I guess since it's difficult for us to hear folks who are in the back of the room, Shannon, right now our little camera is looking at the wall, you know, behind where you were previously standing. If for some reason you stop hearing me or somebody has a question or something, you're going to have to wave your arms in front of the camera.
I'm turning it around, so hopefully you can see the room.
Okay, so do you hear a feedback or echo or anything like that also?
No,
or does it sound good?
The sound is good.
Excellent. Okay, good. So the human dimensions of climate change is, you know, as we like to call it, an interagency collaborative for natural resource management. That's the title we came up with, and HDCC for short. And let's see. Okay, there we go. Good. And this idea generally is came from the problems or the issues associated with natural resource management agencies being challenged by all of the moving parts and the issues that you folks are all very well aware of. And so, you know, we know that there are the human dimension components of economic activities, subsistence practices. You know, you folks are fully aware of what all of those human dimensions data and information needs actually are, and the fact that the natural resource management agencies are managing lands upon which the human communities depend. I guess I should depart quickly, and I was thinking about this the other day, that, you know, some talks are you know, very applied and on the ground, and some talks are at the 60,000 or 30,000 foot level. This talk is probably somewhere between, at like the 10,000 foot level. You folks are all, you know, in the know. You know what's going on. You're very well versed on this topic. So I'm going to be bouncing up and down a little bit, and what I realized on the airplane on Monday is that at about the 10,000 foot level, you're still gaining a great deal of altitude, and the plane is banking hard to go in the right direction, and that's probably when you're the most nauseous. So sorry about that, and I'll assume that you're all laughing at my jokes, even though I can't hear you. So I'm going to talk about the focus, the objectives, and the activities of the HDCC. And what we're really doing here is, you know, we realize that there is a need to work across federal agencies. So that's really the focus of this, is to have an interagency project or an interagency collaborative. The other thing is to do something useful, something that is very applicable for the manager in the field making a decision, or hopefully we can work across all boundaries and, you know, all levels, and be able to provide something useful for the unit level manager who's in the field on a refuge or a park unit or a BLM unit, who actually has to make a decision, as well as provide information to decision and policy makers who might need information about human dimensions issues, and trying to create something that's sufficiently flexible to meet the needs of multiple agencies. You know, again, working across agencies. You know, we try to, you know, you might think, well, what about the other folks who are working in the field, the academics and non-governmental organizations? We're not excluding the work of these people or these people from the group by any means, but as federal agencies, we're trying to do something for ourselves, so that sounds very in our self-interest, but really trying to do something that's useful for public land managers, allowing for and accepting, you know, and including a lot of the work and efforts that are done by other non-federal institutions. This slide is really two sentences that are really nice to say on the first couple pages of a proposal, right? And the overall objective of the project is to focus on producing scientifically valid, consistent methods for analyzing human system resilience and vulnerabilities in an uncertain climate. And let's face it, these two sentences came out of our very first proposal. And the other very important thing is that we are trying to link the social and the ecological systems. That's a very important component of this. And we're all, again, at the 30,000 foot level here, trying to do these very same things. And I think now is a good time for me to talk a little bit about the history of this and where this focus came from. The original idea for this effort was a result of a gentleman named Rob Winthrop, who's the social science Karen, you might tell me his exact title, the social science leader for the Bureau of Land Management, or chief social scientist for the Bureau of Land Management, where we spoke about this idea of trying to work on something like this. We came up with the concept, and we wrote a proposal for the USGS Powell Center. The USGS Powell Center is a think tank process where the idea is you write a proposal to bring together a working group of people who are going to solve some sort of problem or make some scientific advancement. And so the idea was that we were originally going to fund a group of people to get together to come together and actually accomplish a series of tasks. And since then, the project has morphed into what it is now. So while I'm giving you a snapshot of what it sort of looks like now, it also includes some history. So the idea is that the BLM has provided a great deal of intellectual as well as financial backing to get this project off of the ground, and part of the task of the group is to continue to find funding from other agencies and other outlets to advance the effort. So currently, the core team of people and the folks that are putting an effort toward this come from the Bureau of Land Management, NOAA, Department of Interior and National Park Service, Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, the USGS, Fish and Wildlife Service, Office of Policy Analysis. So right now, this is the core project team, we call this. These are the people who are getting on the phone calls right now and trying to really just work out what exactly is the scope of this project, what is the direction that we're going to be running to accomplish the objectives that we have out there. So this is the core people who are actually right now getting on a phone every 2 weeks and actually having conversations about what to do and how to go about doing it. The original structure, and I'm saying original now because this is where it's morphing a little bit, the concept of this is that it's not being worked on in any sort of vacuum, that since it is an interagency effort, since we want there to be, you know what, I completely forgot to start my stopwatch. Sorry about that, little non-sequitorial thinking. How could I be? Well, I'll definitely be on time now when I finish. So the original concept is that it was a working group structure, and we did not want to be operating in any kind of a vacuum and excluding folks. We wanted to have input from researchers, policy level folks, and very importantly from management level folks who are actually making decisions and trying to use this information. We also realize that you have to have a small group of people working together in order to ever actually accomplish any tasks or individual activities that have to happen. So we wanted to have, the original structure was a core group of sort of you know, the core group of the committee, you know, to provide oversight and direction. There was going to be a primary working group of people who would then be, you know, doing a lot of the on-the-ground tasks and actually executing things. And then there's an extended working group who would be reached out to in order to provide input, provide data, you know, provide feedback, and actually help us, you know, make sure that not necessarily that there's just buy-in, but that everything that we're doing from the ground up is real, is valid, is applicable, is functional, and has meaning. So that's the general idea. Currently, we have the working group together who is helping to provide direction and refining these objectives and these tasks that we have. So objective number one is to really create a community of practice. And while Shannon and Dennis and Jeff have the Climate Science Center, which is focusing on this region, and the Climate Science Center focuses broadly on climate change issues, with human dimensions being one component, we're really trying to work across jurisdictional boundaries, across political boundaries, and across the nation. So we could have a community of practice of people at a larger scale and at a somewhat more focused scale. Also recognizing then the system that we're setting up will have some people who check in and check out. You know, so unit level managers may be writing a comprehensive conservation plan, a BLM unit management plan, a park plan, whatever that plan might be. And they may be assigned the task of, you know, writing the social impact assessment or assessing the impacts of climate change in some way. And that unit manager may check in every now and then to our system and then check back out after the plan's there. And then there'll be other specialists who kind of hang there the whole time because that's their area of expertise. But we want to create a community of practice that people have the ability to engage with. I guess you can't see that when I take pauses like that, I'm getting a drink of water. So we want a community of practice. The second thing is that we want a place for them, a forum where this community of practice can actually interact, right? We want the ability of this community to have the ability to talk about practices, talk about and exchange data sets, someplace where they can interact and they can, you know, data can exist, examples can exist, where they can exchange or get information, upload and download information, the place that makes it functional for decision making, right? Not just reports to read, but actually a forum where these people can interact. Objective number 3, and this is I put assessment protocols in a question mark down there, because the idea is, trying to come up with a standardized set of assessment protocols that apply to public land management across jurisdictions in every context and so on and so forth is, that's somewhat of a pipe dream, right? As Shannon said before, many of these, adaptation plans are context specific, if not all of them. So, but we want to come up with some kind of framework that allows managers to know, what are some of the common practices, the common, guidelines and protocols that they can use when faced with making decisions about the impacts or the human dimensions associated with climate change. And if we could ever come up with a set of assessment protocols, that's great. But we, are looking for some level of consistency that folks can look to. So we have the idea of a community of practice. That's a focus. We have the idea of a forum, a place where these people can go to get information. We have the idea that we want to provide a focused set of methods or guidelines or protocols that people can look to, public land managers can go to in order to answer the questions that they have. So activity number one, right? So we have to get the rubber to hit the road at some point. Activity number one is to figure out what are the questions that public land managers are asking. What are the information needs that are out there? And we understand, many of us, understand who operate with public land managers is that, especially at the unit level, a lot of folks who are engaged in writing a management plan or making some kind of decision understand that they need social science information. They know that there's some sort of information that could facilitate their decision-making process, but they're not quite sure what that information is because they're not social scientists. They're some other sort of land manager who's now put into a different context. So we're trying to get out there to understand and create a list of these questions or assess the questions that folks have out there in order to help come up with the information or help direct folks to the information that they can use in order to answer those questions. So you can think of this a little bit of like a gap analysis, a content analysis, that sort of thing. Number two is, this is the idea, we're thinking, well, every context, how do you come up with a list of questions? How do you come up with the things that people need to know? Well, there are a lot of moving parts out there, so we thought, well, why don't we pick out a few places and, roll out a case study of what public land managers are doing and what are the moving parts associated with that location, human dimensions of climate change, and public land management. So we want to go out and do a handful of case studies in a few target areas to understand what are the moving parts, help generate those information needs, those questions that folks are asking out there. The first area that we wanted to go to was Alaska for all of the obvious reasons. There's obvious climate impacts. It's very relevant to most public land management agencies, onshore and offshore. And there's just a lot going on up there. The sequestration issue has created some issues with conducting a case study up there. For example, none of us could ever go there at the moment. There's absolutely no way we could travel up there. So now we're looking around at where, targeting where these first case studies are actually going to happen. The idea also that we're working with is making this relevant to other climate change response efforts. So again, that's the idea that we have a lot of different moving parts, federal agencies and non-federal agencies that have various political and physical jurisdictions that are out there. So trying to choose a case study, geographic location becomes very complex for what we're doing. And this is great, Shannon. I'm glad that you put up your slide associated with the social science projects that are in the North Central Climate Science Center. That's a great example of saying, okay, here's one jurisdiction, the North Central Climate Science Center, that we're thinking about. And this is just one idea of what are the actual case studies, the projects that are going on within this area. That's one layer. This project would dig deeper behind that and actually look at what are the decisions that are being made by public land managers who are trying to use the information that's being produced by those social science projects. So a little bit redundant, but also expanding and using the kind of information that's already being produced by efforts such as this one right here. Initial activity number 3 is to create a project database, right? So this is sort of the forum, right? So the idea is that we want a forum, a place where people can upload, download, exchange, query, find, ask, use information that's out there. So the idea here is that we would have an actual database that would be a web application where folks, public land managers, non-federal agencies can go, and we'd actually have a database with information so that if somebody out there on a Fish and Wildlife Service refuge in Rhode Island needs to answer a question about human impacts, they can log in and find out, well, is there a similar physical environment where somebody dealt with this? Is there a similar question that somebody yells? Similar species, you know, where they can query this database and come up and see what other people have done and what their experiences have been. So folks will be able to interact with each other, enter data, query the database, and actually use this information. So, in case you didn't notice, these were 2 pictures of the same glacier there, USGS pictures, which I found on the internet, on the USGS site yesterday, which is pretty cool. It shows a pretty significant loss of snow in that particular glacier. Just trying to keep it interesting for you.
Rudy, can you hear me?
Just barely, yeah.
You're at about 15 minutes, just to give you a heads up.
At where?
You're at about 15 minutes now.
Okay, yep.
So
We will be, yep. So then one of the things we want to do, of course, everybody wants to write publications and document things. We want to create a principles and guidelines document that that's actually a physical document that's similar to the social impact assessment, sort of, you know, creating this a la carte menu, what you might call it, where folks can actually, there's a physical document that talks about principles and guidelines associated with public land management and human dimensions of climate change issues. And this document would be sort of a synthesis of a lot of the other tasks that I've been talking about. So again, this slide, you know, we're getting toward the end here. That's the meat or the tofu of the situation, depending on your dietary preferences. And this map just shows, you know, so yeah, we're trying to work across and make this relevant to a lot of the other systems that are out there, the rapid ecological assessment areas, the climate science centers, the landscape conservation cooperatives, and you know, there are a lot of others that are out there, and we're trying to, you know, to mash up all of these things, all of these jurisdictions, and trying to work around them or within them to create something common. And, you know, the model du jour, you know, just the idea here is that regardless, you know, Shannon had a whole bunch of models that were up there too. You know, the idea is that we're all working pretty much from the same concepts, the same pages. We're, you know, integrating social ecological systems, depending on which model is your favorite one. You know, but we're using the same concepts and trying to accomplish the same goals of integrating social ecological systems. So where are we now? We've had a lot of committee meetings, you know, with that core group of committee members that we had up there, trying to, you know, refine those initial activities and get them to the point where they're going to take off. We're in the process of hiring a term employee, you know, who's actually going to get their feet on the ground and do these things. Of course, we got stuck in the sequestration mess. So the alternative right now, and you see that looking for a student now, just saying I'm looking for to employ somebody, a student specifically, who's going to be able to help us put the rubber on the road and actually accomplish these tasks. So that's sort of a little mini advertisement that if you know somebody who's currently at a university as master's or PhD level student looking for some projects to work on, pass their emails on to me and let me know. With that, we should be at our question period.
Great. Thank you, Rudy. Does anyone have any comments or questions before we move on to Betsy, also knowing that we're going to have a discussion period after these talks, but if anybody has anything burning. Betsy, if you want to. All right, I think we're just going to move along to Betsy. Thank you, Rudy, for that. That was really helpful to understand where you guys are with all of that. All right, so now we have Betsy Neely, and if you could just introduce yourself to the group.
Hi, my name is Betsy Neely. I'm a conservation planner with the Nature Conservancy, and today I'm going to bring us back down to the earth, to a landscape that's about 2.5 million acres big, and it's a project that we've been working on since 2009 as part of the Southwest Climate Change Initiative. And Shannon asked me to talk specifically about our vulnerability work and the adaptation work. I thought I'd give you just an overview of the project. As all of you know, addressing and reducing the effects of climate change is one of the top priorities of everyone at this conference, and certainly the Nature Conservancy. The Conservancy across the globe has been focusing on reducing the risks of climate change to nature and people, and there's a lot of emphasis on the coast. But today we'll be talking about a dryland system that's having to deal with drought. But I really am excited about the possibility of expanding our partnership with the Climate Science Center as we move into this next phase of our planning. I think we've gotten to a point where we really need to look at what we've accomplished and where we're going. We feel the most important thing we can do now is to develop basin-wide adaptation strategies that help to build social and ecological resilience. So I'll be giving you some examples of perhaps what not to do and some best practices as well. So generally we'll just give you an outline of the history of this pilot project and some of the steps that we've done over the past few years and the tools that we've used, and then end up with best practices, lessons learned, and what have been our biggest challenges and our next steps. And this green, in the green, that's not the whole state. That's just the southwest part of the state. But you can see the Gunnison Basin there covers most of Gunnison County and a couple of other counties there, and spans elevation range of 7,000 feet all the way up to above tree line. And we got started on this project with the help and support of the Southwest Climate Change Initiative, which was initiated by the Conservancy, but working with partners such as Wildlife Conservation Society and Molly Cross, who's here. Good, she can help fill in any gaps. But a number of other partners came together to respond to this issue of climate change, and so much has happened. But basically the goal of the initiative, the Southwest Climate Change Initiative, still stands, and that's to share or develop these methods and tools and share them with conservation practitioners, natural resource managers, and policymakers across the region and actually beyond. We started with a series of workshops that Molly helped us facilitate, which was great. And we decided to focus on one pilot landscape in each of the 4 states of the Southwest. And the Gunnison's there in the upper right, and I won't get into all the other ones. But if you have questions about those, you can go to newmexicoconservation.org. But we held these initial climate adaptation workshops in each of the 4 states at these pilot landscapes. And what has been so fabulous about this project for me is just the learning network aspect of it, that well, each has its own habitat, as you can see, or ecosystems. We're applying similar methods, and we're really trying to go from planning to implementation. Why did we choose the Gunnison Basin? Well, for a whole number of reasons. Largely, there was high climate exposure from some of the early work Carrie Inquist did and others, but there is a large suite of species of special concern there, such as the Gunnison sage grouse, which is currently proposed for listing as endangered, but a whole suite of ecosystems ranging from sagebrush all the way to the alpine. We wanted to build on the research of the Rocky Mountain Biological Lab and all the great climate work that had been done there, build on the existing partnerships centered around the grouse before the proposed rule, and when a lot of activity has been taken place, and also to build on TNC's conservation efforts. We have a number of conservation easements in the area, and we've done some conservation action planning that we could build off on. So what are some of our key questions? Really, we wanted to know, what's most at risk and why, and then what are the strategies that we can use to help the species and the ecosystems and the people adapt. And we were lucky to have Corey Knapp, who's a PhD student at the University of Alaska Fairbanks, to approach us and say she wanted to help us assess the social vulnerability and resilience of the Gunnison Basin. And that was probably the best thing that ever happened to the project, frankly. And she was really wanting to look at, she couldn't accomplish the world, but she wanted to focus on a couple of land-based livelihoods and look at their resilience and vulnerability, and how are the people going to respond to climate change? And I'll get into that. So over the past 3 years, after the workshop, we held this workshop where we followed the ACT framework, and then we did an ecological vulnerability assessment, and then Corey did her social vulnerability assessment. There were honestly 2 parallel efforts, but we did, they were almost at the same time, and so we were integrating in some respects, but probably, frankly, not as integrated as we should have done. And then we had this wonderful opportunity to apply for WCS funding for a climate adaptation project on the ground, and we jumped on that. And again, I think that was second best thing that ever happened to the project, because people have really rallied around getting something done on the ground. It helps people understand what we can do to address climate change. And now we're embarking on this, what should have been step 3, but basin-wide strategies to really build social and ecological resilience. This was what got us started. You can see that the study area is largely Forest Service lands in the green, and then secondly, BLM lands and National Park Service lands and private lands and the bottom lands in the valleys. And so we have a lot of different stakeholders there. We interviewed those stakeholders before our first workshop and asked them what they would be most concerned about to focus the adaptation workshop on, and they chose the sage grouse, no-brainer there, headwater, streams and rivers, and then the alpine wetlands. Of course, they had some others on their list that they were concerned about, but we couldn't take them on. And basically what this workshop did was it was a starting point for us to test this ACT framework, the Adaptation for Conservation Targets framework, and that's now published in Cross et al. 2012, and there's another publication as well. But we wanted to test this framework and develop preliminary strategies for species and ecosystems. But really what this did was set the whole foundation for all the work that's happened since then. And this is the framework. Hopefully this is review for most of you. I won't get into all the details, but we, at the workshop, we focused on the left side of the screen to select the, well, we had already selected the targets, but develop a management objective, to assess the climate change effects. And one important part of that is building a conceptual model, which you might think, well, this is just all focused on ecosystems, but really if you look at those models, we're looking at the drivers of the threats and the stresses and the impacts. And ultimately, we really do get at those social and economic drivers. And then our third step was to identify the points that we thought we could make a difference in developing strategies. And then finally, we made a good faith effort at starting to prioritize our actions. And then steps 5 and 6 were post-workshop. But what was great about the workshop is it set us up for implementation. We asked very well-respected climate scientists to help develop these climate scenarios that we used. I won't get into the details there, but and wanted to thank Western Water, especially in NCAR and UCAR, Linda Mearns and Joe Barsugli. So one of the things about the workshop I think that was most effective is we had a strong educational component of it in these plenary sessions. And people were really hungry for this information. But then we ran through these conceptual models, and then we had 3 breakout groups, and then we had those folks, the local managers, say Parks and Wildlife, present back what we came up with. And I think that there was a real sense of ownership with the products. Here's an example of the products. One of the products, just very simplified, but we looked at impacts, and then we tried to develop these strategies or strategic actions to get at those impacts. This happened to be one of our no-regret strategies focused on the Gunnison sage-grouse. After the workshop, we didn't know what was going to happen. Towards the end, we had some discussions, and it turns out that a small group of our partners really wanted to continue the dialogue. And so Patrick McCarthy, who's our former director of Southwest Climate Change Initiative, and I went back to Gunnison and held some meetings with a small group of partners, and we developed a team charter and a work plan. But really, the local people were very hungry for better understanding the climate impacts and better understanding the climate scenarios. And they really wanted, actually the VLM director wanted to jump in right into implementing no-regret strategies. And so we said, well, wait, let's do first things first. And anyway, I think ultimately we're making pretty good progress towards our goals. Now we have 16, 17 members. It's a pretty informal group. It's ad hoc. We've got some non-traditional members now, the stock growers, and we're really delighted to have the Upper Gunnison River Water Conservancy District and others. We were very lucky to get Southern Rockies LCC funding at this point to help us move to our next step, which was to develop. We felt that one of the most important things to do was to understand the whole suite of species and ecosystems that would be at risk. That then would set priorities for our adaptation strategies development. So we spent about a year on this vulnerability assessment. We didn't really come up with brand new methods. We used the great work of Hector Galbraith back in Massachusetts for our ecosystems, kind of a qualitative vulnerability assessment. And then we used the NatureServe Climate Change Vulnerability Index. We didn't have that for the ecosystems at this time. And we had literature review, small workshops, and so you can get online and see that if you like. And then Corey's work was really looking at 2 livelihoods, ranching and the recreation industry, and trying to help us better understand how they would be impacted by climate change. What are the kinds of things that these groups would do? And what are some of their preliminary adaptation strategies? And she interviewed about 35 people. The town just loves her. I'm not sure what it is. She's local. She doesn't have a southern accent, but she's just she's gotten on the front page of the newspaper. It brought our whole project alive to the community, and so she scratched the surface, but it was really great. I can't get into the details, but she helped us better understand what the ranchers and the recreation industry were thinking. For example, they're obviously their livelihood. The ranchers depend on water, and they're very concerned about drought. The larger the circle there, the more the people were concerned about that issue. You can't really see it that well, but she's working on some publications now of this work. It really helped us better understand what some of the aspects of the ranching community, for example, which is so important in the community, how they could be resilient, and then what are some of their vulnerabilities. For example, they really rely on these federal permits for grazing. Well, in a drought, they need a lot of flexibility to be able to graze their cows at different times, but the feds sometimes are a little stricter about timing, and they have their own limitations. So those are some of the kinds of things that are really going to help when we develop adaptation strategies to help us really understand their perspective, and they are very important. So from Corey's work, we've really learned that it's important to talk to the locals, not just the natural resource managers, but to really understand, if we're going to be effective at conservation, we really need to get their perspective. And now this was kind of a watershed for us, because we said, oh boy, our next step, we really need to do a better job of this than we had in the past, just focusing on species and ecosystems. So I won't get into the details. There is a session tomorrow that Molly's organizing that will talk more in depth about our climate adaptation project on the ground. But I tell you, we can plan and plan and plan, but until you actually do something on the ground, people don't really trust the process. And this is the way that we've been able to get into the community. We may not have involved the community as much in the vulnerability assessment, the ecological piece, but we've really been able to make some headway here, particularly with our ranchers. Overall, the challenges, I think, that if I had to just pinpoint it to two, first, I think our working group is really excited, the natural resource managers. We've got a whole variety of people. But at our last meeting in December of the Gunnison Climate Working Group, this informal group, we said we really need broader support. We need our political leaders. If we're going to be effective, we have to get more of our citizens engaged. So that's our next step. We're hoping to engage them in our next step, and we're hoping to formalize the partnership and to bring these folks in. And the other challenge is we've had several false starts, but we have been challenged by the fact that there's not an existing appropriate guidance for truly integrating the social with the ecological systems. That's why I was so delighted when Shannon and I started talking, and then that opened doors to working with USGS and University of Montana, the social scientists. So I think we're right there on the watershed here, hoping that in our next phase we'll be able to truly have a framework and a set of adaptation strategies that gives more weight to the human dimensions, a lot of what Rudy was just talking about. We have this whole next season to finish finish our demonstration of our pilot adaptation project. We've set up a monitoring program. We're transferring that over to the local university for their continued action over time involving students. As I said, we're going to formalize our working group, and then we're gearing up to develop these basin-wide strategies. We've been working with some of our social scientists and our ecologists and planners, interdisciplinary group, on a proposal that we think has a lot of promise for helping us better integrate the social piece. And it's not just focused on the social piece, not just focused on the ecosystems, but truly takes the best parts of some of these methods the social scientists have been working on, and the best parts of the ACT framework, which we truly believe is a great way to have a science-based adaptation plan. So we're more coming on that, we hope. And overall, what have we learned? Basically, just how important it is to engage the local community. I mean, that's a no-brainer. That's why we're all sitting in the room. And a lesson learned is, in retrospect, it would have been great had we included the social science right from the get-go. We didn't. But I think that it's not a fatal flaw. I think that it's there's still time. I mean, it's an evolving project. It's an iterative process. And we're lucky enough to have an open-minded community, interestingly enough, in a small rural community. And I think this idea, no matter what you do, if you can at least just start something on the ground that people can see, and then you can work side by side with these people. There's in the bottom slide, there's the rancher that we've been working with, explaining on our field trip what the rationale is behind building these small rock structures to help restore these small drainages and brood rearing habitat. And let's see. And then I mean, I think we may not be doing something extremely innovative or different, but you know, a lot of times we have these tools. They're right there. We just need to think about utilizing them, or we need to increase the pace or the scale. And in this case, on number 4, we've done this pilot project. We've only completed 1 year, but the local partners say, well, we want to scale it up. Well, we say, well, right now we don't have the funding or the capacity or ability, but now that's on our list. Let's see. Okay, we're done. Okay, thank you all to all our collaborators. We've just been so lucky and fortunate. We're hoping to expand the collaboration to the Climate Science Center, especially. I don't think anybody on here is a social scientist except for Corey Knapp, and that's a whole, and I think that, you know, we definitely need that. Bill Travis, sorry, Bill, if you're listening. Yeah, Bill has been fantastic. Bill's been on our board, and he's been an advisor to the project, and can't forget him. And then we especially thank our funders, because we wouldn't be able to do this project. So thanks very much. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Betsy. Does anybody have a quick question? You want to stay up here so these guys can hear you on the thing? Okay, we've got a bunch of questions, so we'll try our best to repeat them for the people online. So try and make them repeatable questions, please. Go ahead.
Okay, the other 3 landscape projects, are they operating with a similar approach, or are they all talking change?
That's the greatest. So the question was if the other 3 pilots are using a similar approach, and how are they, how are they communicating between them?
Yes, we are. I mean, we are a learning network, and while we don't have our fearless leader, Patrick McCarthy, who's moved on to be the director of the Upper Colorado River Basin Conservation Director, but we are still talking. We communicate. We just had a workshop, for example, a Southwest Climate Change Initiative workshop, and Molly helped us train 8 new landscapes in this ACT framework, and it was just fantastic. There's a lot of interest out there. And we had a meeting last fall in the Jemez, and some of our partners from the Gunnison went, and so they feel they're part of a bigger effort. They're doing different things. I mean, the Bear River is working on fish conservation of the Bonneville cutthroat trout, removing barriers. The Arizona is working on, largely focused on NEPA, getting large landscape fire treatment into NEPA and so on. So we're doing taking different actions, but I think it's grounded in this ACT framework.
To another quick question? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, Betsy, you did mention, I'm just curious, in this context where it's, it's probably 1/3 Forest Service, 1/3 GLM, 1/3 private, yes, in terms of ownership and responsibility.
Yeah.
The linkage of the social and ecological in the context of updating management plans from a Forest Service standpoint and GLM, you didn't actually mention that. And where is that? Is that happening in terms of this is informing the update of those management plans from the agency perspective?
So the question was about the mix of land tenure and management across jurisdictions, Forest Service and BLM, and how this effort, if and how this effort is informing the updating of their resource management plans.
That's the most critical piece. That's the prize. And so what we're hoping, actually one of the, of course, the next step is to develop these basin-wide strategies. And that is to inform the resource management plans. And the working group decided that the next step is to look at their current actions and activities and see if they're climate smart. And Linda Joyce has done some really interesting work in this area. Very simple tools, screening tools, and that's what our BLM especially is interested in doing that. But that is where ultimately we want to go. Folks like the Ken Stallnecker with the Park Service is really interested in all of this work. He recently said he's one of our local leaders because the Park Service needs to be doing this, but they really truly believe we need to be doing it across jurisdictional boundaries. But it's up to each agency to do it, but we need to get there.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think for the sake of time, we're going to move on. People can talk to Betsy after the session. We do have another session coming in here right at noon, so we got to make sure we're somewhat on time. So I'm going to hand the mic over now to Lisa Dilling, who is with the Center for Science, Technology, Policy, and Research at University of Colorado Boulder. She's based in the Environmental Studies program. She's also newly the Deputy Director for Social Sciences of the NOAA-funded Western Water Assessment. So I've just asked Lisa to take about 5 or 10 minutes to talk about what they talked about in the overlapping morning session. There was a RESA, and she can explain what the RESA is for those of you who don't know, and a little bit about some of the projects she's working on. And she's also presenting on our workshop on Friday.
Great. Thanks, Shannon. And it's one of the blessings and curses of a conference like this where there's just, you want to go to everything and it's all at the same time, and it's just so it's an overabundance of riches. Yes, so as Shannon said, I'm from Western Water Assessment, also University of Colorado Boulder. And I also wanted to mention another connection is that our director, Kristen Avert, is one of the PIs on the North Central Climate Science Center, so we have this connection now institutionally as well. And our other associate director is Noah Moloch, some of you may know, who works a lot on snow hydrology and measuring snowpack and so on in the mountains. How many people are familiar with RESAs and what they are? Heard that? So most of you kind of, or just a really tiny 2-second description is the RESA stands for Regional Integrated Sciences and Assessment. That's what RISA stands for. It's a program that's gone on now about 15 years, funded by NOAA, and the idea is to fund ongoing assessment and research activities on a regional basis around the country. So it started a long time ago with a RISA in Pacific Northwest, and it's now expanded to be, there's RISAs in most regions of the country now. Maybe some gaps in the upper Midwest, I think, but there's about 11 of them now around the country. And they're based at universities, but their goal is to conduct research in such a way that it's conducted with partners and stakeholders so that the questions being asked and researched are actually relevant to people in the real world. So getting people out of their ivory towers, trying to really move into decision maker space. And the focus is, as you can guess from a NOAA-funded activity, it's focused a lot on things like climate variability, but in all the ways that climate variability can be important, and climate change as well. So the RISAs have different foci depending on which RISA it is. The RISA I'm from is Colorado, Utah, and Wyoming. So it's those 3 states, and ours is called the Western Water Assessment. So from the name you can guess, it's sort of focused on water. But again, water, as we all know, it's connected to everything. So we do kind of go into lots of different areas in our history. We're over 10 years old now, so we've been renewed a couple times. Usually they're about 5-year projects, just so that to get a sense. The idea being that to build ongoing, iterative, long-term relationships, you need to fund projects at a longer term, and then they're evaluated after 5 years to see how they're doing and if they should be renewed or not. So types of things that we've done, again, over the time, things like studying water management, working with ranchers, looking at snow and, a lot of the basic hydrologic sciences as well, energy and water connection, ecosystems, especially things like the impact of the beetle kill, dust, and how that can impact the hydrology of the system, which is kind of a new, interesting area. Actually, it turns out it does affect, well, you can imagine it affects albedo, but also can affect the runoff of the snow and so forth, so it can have an impact on water. So those are just teasers about Western water in general. But really, Shannon wanted me to talk about what happened next door this morning, just so that we can kind of share across, across channels here. So we had just a short session with some talks from the RISA program, so updates. First one was from Roger Polwardy, who's a long-standing figure in that community. He's one of the people who started the RISA program. Really just laying out some of the philosophy and what we've learned so far from doing these projects for quite a while. And I really liked one of his graphics was about kind of when research can really lead towards innovation and transformation as opposed to just being some sort of a symbolic gesture or kind of fail in general. Mm-hmm. And it was a really nice matrix. I can draw it later on Friday, but basically the idea is that when research is willing to be flexible and change with the situation, and when community goals or governmental goals are willing to be flexible and change, so you imagine that confluence of those 2 situations is really when you can get innovation, because your information system is transforming and being innovative, and your community is also receptive to being changing with the receipt of that information. It's a relationship. Both of them have to be changing, being willing to be dynamic to get that innovation space. Otherwise, you can have research being sort of trying to be changing the space, but the goals aren't shifting in the real world and the community. Real world, you know what I mean, and vice versa, and so on. So that's really the quadrant where it can really make a difference. And of course, RISA, like you guys here, are really interested in advancing outcomes on the ground. Really making a difference on the ground. And so you really spoke a lot about that and about lessons identified. The difference between lessons being identified and lessons actually learned. Mm-hmm. So we always say, oh yeah, we learned all these lessons. Well, sometimes we just identify the lessons, but do we actually learn them, which means it actually gets incorporated into practice and actually changes something out there. So little nuggets from that. Next up is Sarah Trainer from the Alaska RISA. So this is the one that's based in Alaska. And she's done a study where they really looked at what's happening on the ground for adaptation to climate change. And I mean, Shannon's totally familiar with this situation where, I mean, out of all the places in the world, Alaska is one of the places where it's happening now and communities are having to adapt. But what was interesting, just again, a few nuggets, tons of examples of what was happening on the ground, all the way from changes in wildfire management to changes in community practices, to changes in the oil and gas industry. But hardly any group was actually saying this was happening strictly because of climate change. It's like, things are happening. We've had to adjust when we bring in equipment for fighting wildfire. We have to fight wildfire differently. We can't just beat it out with a spruce branch now. We actually have to have like equipment and tanks of water, what we didn't have to have. So things like that. But the interesting thing is, like, there's a lot of emphasis in the adaptation community on planning, and this stuff on the ground is happening without planning, really. It's really disconnected from all these efforts at the higher levels about planning. And so that's sort of interesting, but then it also begs the question about evaluation. How are things that you're doing on the ground kind of spontaneously? Maybe they're great, maybe they're not, but are we evaluating those at all, and are we also connecting those up to the planning space where people are actually planning? And that disconnect, pointing out that disconnect. Next person was David Bidwell from the Great Lakes RISA. So that's a RISA that's actually not state boundary designated, but it's actually bounded by the watershed, if you will, of the Great Lakes. So that if you can imagine a picture with all the Great Lakes and like a little squiggly line kind of around all of them, that's how their RISA is defined. And the thing that David really pointed out was the importance, of course, of sustained interaction, which we're all, I think Betsy's pointed out really well, like this idea of having to really build networks that last over time. And they've done some really interesting network analysis. So looking at who's connected to whom, how do the clusters look when you look at people, who's talking to whom, and who actually spans clusters. So in their system, they had about 3 major clusters of people that sort of all talk together. Only a couple people, nobody spanned all 3 of these groups. And the couple people that did span tended to, or he called them bridgers. We might have other words for them. But that these people were really important, and they often were, maybe they were in a special role in the group, maybe they were advocate or some kind of a role where that really enabled them to span the boundaries really well of these groups. Then I was the last speaker in the presentation, and I spoke a little bit on my project on drivers of adaptation. And that is a project we're doing in Colorado, Wyoming, and Utah, looking at the question of why communities adapt. So not what they're doing or what the impacts might be on the community, but why do people take action in general? And the framing here is sort of thinking, like if you have, say you have 5 communities, all with a flood risk, they're all up in the canyon, they all have the risk of getting a big flood. Some communities are really proactive and do a lot. Some don't do as much. Why is that? What's the difference? What can account for the difference? So we've done a study looking across, as I said, the 3 states, and we've just randomly selected 60 communities across the state, the 3 states, and interviewing, first of all, finding out if our premise is true. Is there really a difference in response to these hazards, or are people just pretty much doing all the same thing? We do find there is a response. There's a big response, a big difference, and also just perception, what hazards you think are most important to you. And I should say also, this is not with the question of climate change adaptation, because in our group here, or in our 3 states, we didn't think that the average city would necessarily have a lot going on specifically labeled as climate change adaptation. So, but we're taking this behavior question as a proxy. If you're doing something in response to a well-known, well-characterized hazard like blizzards or floods or droughts, we might be able to make some inferences about what might motivate people for the longer term. So, so I just reported on the variation in the responses across, and then the question of why is what we're really getting into now, so I didn't answer that quite yet, but just a teaser on that is that it looks like the role of champions is really important. There's a lot of different hypotheses, like events can spur action, money, having resources, a champion, there's other different types of things. Information is another hypothesis, but champions really kind of rise into the top, and so it really being important, at least at the city scale, for a lot of communities. So preview of Friday, and I'm out of time here, so preview of Friday I'm going to talk about my project on, that I did with my student on public lands adaptation, what's going on the ground in these 3 states in terms of federal public lands managers. We did a big survey across the BLM, the Forest Service, Fish and Wildlife Service, and the National Park Service, asking just sort of what was going on, what kinds of information would they use, what do they see as barriers to adaptation, and that was in the climate change context, and as well just sort of what their concerns are. So that might be interesting for Betsy or maybe some others too. It sounds like there's some overlaps with things that are interesting. Oh no, Betsy and also the person that spoke on the phone. Rudy, that's what I was thinking. Sorry, Rudy, speaking about trying to provide information out to that space. So, see you all again, I guess, on Friday.
Thanks, Lisa. All right, so we're pushing up against 11:30. I did want to leave a little bit of time at the end of the session to have more of a dialogue and talk about what we're going to do on Friday and look at the agenda a little bit and talk about the most effective use of our afternoon session to achieve our objectives. I'm going to give about 5 minutes each to Bob Goff to talk about some of the tribal work related to what we're focusing on here, and then after him, Dan Williams from Forest Service. So you each want to just give a little overview of your related work, and I'm going to set this for you so you can see how much time you're using.
You put slides in it.
Oh, you have slides? Okay. You want to introduce yourself first?
Sure. Good morning. Bob Goff, Intertribal Council and Utility Policy Secretary, and also one of the authors, contributors to the Great Plains, and author on the tribal chapter for the National Climate Assessment. And as we're bringing up slides, basically we are one of those community groups that you need to be talking to. And we've been talking with you guys for a long time. But we come to it not from the climate science side of things as much as...
Takes a minute. You have to wing it.
Sure. Not from the climate science side of things, but from the mitigation and adaptation concerns. And I'll put a plug in while this is coming up for a conference at UCAR this summer, first week of July, on rising voices of indigenous peoples in the global climate conversation. So we've been trying to hold the door open there for indigenous peoples and their voices, not just in the U.S., but the Pacific, and for indigenous peoples around the world through the IPCC.
For some reason, oh, there we go. So the question was if this has anything to do with the conversations with the Earth Project?
Yes, yes. We've been engaged through what's called ROAM, Rights of Mother Earth, conversations that have been going on around some of these issues as well, yes. It's broader than just the Americas, that's been mostly the indigenous peoples of North and South America talking that conversation. In any case, we're looking at the fact that, there we go. Thank you. I'll just breeze through these quickly, which this doesn't.
Why? It's kind of frozen. There, just do it in this way.
Okay, we'll do it this way. These are some of the activities and associations we've been involved with Intertribal Coup for almost 2 decades now, working with a number of federal agencies on resource issues representing the tribes in the northern Great Plains, particularly North Dakota, South Dakota, Nebraska, and Wyoming. Just take a moment. Pat Spears has passed, and as a tribal politician, he led Intertribal Coup in the climate area for adaptation and response. And when he was, we got the information that solar activity presented more of an impact than had been previously thought. We knew a lot of people responsible for carbon dioxide in the atmosphere would rejoice and saying, see, it's natural, it's not up to us. He instead said that means humans have the swing vote. And it's that kind of insight that comes from Indian country that we've got a dog in this hunt. We've really got to be sharp about what we do about it. We've talked less and less, more and more, we've talked less and less about climate and more about weather. Because most real people don't live in terms of an abstraction of 2 layers of climate, but in real weather. And we found that we haven't met a weather denier yet. So the conversation rolls on to what do you do about it. Not a lot of help for mitigation of climate change, but a lot of help for adaptation and what you do for the particular regions. Our region in the Northern Plains has very vulnerable economically, socially, especially the reservations in any of the indexes you have. So we've been looking at mitigation, energy, and housing, that nexus, and water is involved in both, but primarily looking at energy. We can see that shifting from carbon production to carbon reduction makes a whole lot of sense in mitigation, but housing really is a large part of the built, it's the major part of the built environment in Indian country and is responsible for over 40% of the carbon produced on the reservation, whether we've got coal or oil or gas resources or not. So looking at that as an area to be working is considerable. Also in terms of adaptation, we've got to bring renewables into the picture and working with houses that are far better suited, future-proof we call them, to whatever is loaded in the pipeline and heading our way. I just want to put this in here. This is the North American grid, and as you can see, the separation is between Montana and the Dakotas, Montana, Wyoming, and the Dakotas in our region. All of the Western governors' planning has been left to the group that controls the Western Interconnect. So the Dakotas are not, although while we're part of the Western governors, we're not in their energy and water planning. We're in the Eastern Interconnect, and we are the outlying province to the entire Eastern Interconnect. We get very little attention in this regard. But you can see the wind resources in the Northern Plains are tremendous. Great opportunity there for both mitigation and adapting our current systems. And that's where we're running into a lot of social and institutional barriers. Business as usual in the upper Great Plains. There's been hydro with coal now built on top of that. And during the drought period, almost 85% of our power from Western Area Power Administration, the hydro resource, 85% of that power was delivered was coal power because of the lack of hydro. And it goes at high coal costs. Trying to get wind on the system dominated by coal is formidable, whether it's the rail or the transmission system. We've been working as an environmental justice project for the tribes in this region with partners of Department of Energy and the EPA, looking at these issues, the vulnerabilities that we've suffered from the build-out of the hydropower dams and the flooding of the reservations, and looking at where environmental justice as one of the vulnerabilities in the region can be turned into an opportunity for economic development around wind. We've worked with WAPA on the wind hydro feasibility study. While it came up short in terms of climate, basically Congress mandated a study of 30 wet years, 30 mixed, 30 dry years. WAPA basically picked 10 wet years, multiplied it by 3, 10 mixed years, multiplied it by 3, and 10 dry years, multiplied it by 3, and came up with how much power they would need under each scenario, and then selected the wet scenario. So there's the climate science in action, folks. Maybe some more opportunity to work there. Prevailing wind directions, we get wind different times of the year from different spaces, northwest and south, but doing it programmatically across the entire grid system would give you almost constant wind at some level of capacity. And we're looking to bring the tribal colleges and educate our young people into these areas of jobs that may become available in the coming decades. Working with the Climate Science Center, this is our region, the Missouri River Basin, working with these agencies throughout on the opportunity of a longer, higher resolution climate science for this region as mandated by the Congress, because we think that this is actually the feng shui for the wind and water nexus working together for a hydropower dynamo in the Northern Plains. Take wind, the most abundant, cleanest resource, but least dispatchable, and mix it with hydro, when you have it, the most dispatchable. So that's the opportunity. The second area, and I'll just go through this quickly, is our housing. 30% of our housing are trailers, which function well during that small human comfort range, but we go from 120 to 30 below in the Northern Plains already. What's different is, as we saw last summer, we don't usually get triple digits for 3 weeks in a row. And that's becoming one of the impacts. It's the heat, not the humidity, that can get you in the plains. And seeing houses that are built to be protecting the inhabitants from those outside temperatures for longer periods of time that aren't energy dependent, that depend basically on straw bale, for example, an old technology coming into new use in this region. Because of its insulative values, it's a far superior to the trailers and to conventional homes. Basically, it works more like a thermos bottle. The temperature inside becomes independent of the temperatures outside, unlike Adobe, which is a mass and you are basically radiating heat very slowly, albeit, but the thermos bottle is where we want to be. We're looking at these strategies for resilience in the face of weather extremes. And we also have a little hesitancy with resilience in the sense that sometimes that word means getting back to the status quo versus, how do we do it better? What are the opportunities for that? We look at the housing situation in the Northern Plains in the context of North America, and we see a great diversity of housing for seasoned cultures that have been here over 40,000 years. The housing diversity was great. Where we are now provides us an opportunity to make a difference throughout Indian country because one house doesn't fit all.
Meanwhile, those are the same houses the tribes have in Alaska.
Exactly.
And they're completely inefficient and inappropriate for what they are in the Dakotas because they're HUD financed. They're literally exactly the same.
So we think the tribes as a government has a very special and unique role with regard to housing. In the mainstream system, housing portions, elements of the housing industry are scattered throughout. There's some government, some zoning, some this, some that, some separate planning, construction, unemployment, financing. All of these issues are scattered throughout the greater economy. In Indian country, it all comes under the tribal government, where since most of the residents can be eligible for housing monies from HUD, the tribes run the housing programs. They get to select the design, they get to select who builds it. So this is a measure of dealing with our unemployment, our housing, our energy, our climate crises, all in one fell swoop. And particularly the insurance industry. Tribes could not get conventional insurance. 430 tribal housing authorities have pooled their resources and developed their own self-insurance company. This insurance company answers to the housing authorities, answers to the tribes. And seeing this alignment of opportunity in looking at future-proofed homes, we started looking at what the risk pool was and what the perils that they've had. And we see that wind, fire, and water were three of the most important. In fact, it's over 66% of their perils. And we live in the Great Plains. Wind damage is high from tornadoes or other windstorms. We know that straw bale has survived where conventional housing hasn't. We know it's fire resistant. We know that the water damage is not from flooding from external sources, but mostly from flooding from broken pipes, which is an element of either poor insulation, unable to, or unaffordability of heating through the winter, and abandonment of homes, and causing a whole bigger infrastructure problem. Straw bale, you have to design for all of these things to start with. So at least 2/3 of their perils could be directly mitigated by this whole area. We're working finally with NIDIS, just to close out here, working with bringing the drought monitoring information program to the Northern Plains. NOAA has not had a big presence with programs with the tribes in the Northern Plains as they have in the Pacific area, so we're able to integrate that at this point. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you, Bob. He's an old pro. He can just whiz right through those slides given a few minutes. Yeah, so Bob was kind of a late addition to the agenda, so that's why we are a little pressed for time. But Dan, if you want to just get for a couple minutes, talk about your stuff, and then we'll try and have a bit of a discussion for the remainder of the session. Here's your time.
Okay. So basically, I just want to provide a little bit of background on what we've been doing with the Forest Service in terms of our approach to social vulnerability and adaptive capacity. About 2 years ago or so, the Forest Service Washington office, the research branch, launched an initiative to try to get the various stations involved in this topic. And so we have a working group that we established across some of the different stations. And this
part of this group met about 2 years ago, 2 years ago now, for a workshop and identified a set of research goals around the topic of social vulnerability and adaptive capacity. And one of those projects is a project that I'm primarily associated with, and Karina Wyborn back here is also working on this project. And basically it involves taking much of the conceptual, covering much of the conceptual ground that Shannon talked about earlier this morning, where we take a contextual approach to social vulnerability, and then we've designed some research protocols that have to do with this idea of iterative scenario building as a social process by which communities are engaged in building their own climate change scenarios. And so we started a process of evaluating this protocol. It's also a chance to learn about how people perceive climate change risk and so forth. So there's data coming in, if you will, plus public involvement and engagement in climate change as they go through this process. And we did a case in the Big Hole Valley of Montana, just collected the data summer and fall of this year, and Karina's now engaged in collecting data and doing interviews in Grand County, Colorado, and she's living in Grand County and came down for this meeting. And we're also hoping to get involved with the North Central Climate Science Center in terms of some further research that would involve, for example, the Gunnison and some of the work that Betsy talked about earlier. Did I leave anything out? I think that's basically it, and we'll be at the thing on Friday to talk about it some more.
Great. Thanks, Dan. So, excuse me, I just ate a mint and it stuck to my throat. So that's the end of our kind of talk portion, or presentation portion, I should say, and we have about 20 minutes left. Hi, I'm back. I think looks like we still have 7 people on the go-to meeting. So they've been talking to each other. Can you guys hear me okay now? Is everybody still all right on that end? Anybody have any questions or comments you want to chime in with now, remembering you might be on mute? Yeah, thanks, John. So, sorry, what was that, Rudy?
We're all okay on our end. Just letting you know we're still here.
Good, good, thanks. So, I'm going to actually bring this laptop over to the table and see if that works so that we can have maybe more of a conversation, although, of course, all the wires are completely entangled. But in the meantime, maybe at least pass around. This is the agenda for our Friday workshop, and just wanted to talk through a little bit, sort of where we go from here, what we're going to do on Friday, talk about the afternoon session in particular. And by the way, for those of you who are kind of on the periphery here and might be interested in still seeing what we do on Friday, there will be a webinar for that meeting as well. So just let me know. I can email you the full email and instructions if you want to call in for any of it. Unfortunately, I didn't expect more than our group to be here, so I don't have enough agendas for everybody. And let me pull it up on the web for the people on the webinar. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I think just actually what I kind of would like to do is, in a sense, do those hand in hand, because basically the objectives for this workshop are more or less the same as what they are today, which is really to synthesize what's out there, identify gaps, build this community or network of practice, and really develop a research agenda. And so the morning is going to be similar to what we've done here, which is presentations on related projects, the frameworks that have been used. And the afternoon session for Friday is when we really want to kind of roll up our sleeves and get into how we sort of identify projects and activities that are ripe for this group and the North Central Climate Science Center to support as we move forward. So I think the discussion here can kind of go hand in hand with what might be the best way to sort of move that forward. So if anybody has, and I'm just going to pull up the agenda here too so people on the phone can see it, but I forget which one it is, of course. I think it's this one. Actually, it doesn't because it's probably not final. So if anybody has any, either online or in the room, if anybody has any reflections on anything we've talked about so far. Dennis, did you have any particular questions for the group? Okay. You want to? Okay.
So, the presentations today is really, I think, represents the state of art right now, which is very disparate activities. I mean, I think my sense, and I'm an ecosystem scientist, so I've worked across the divide to really try to incorporate social science approaches and formulating questions in a much more integrative way. But I still see the community at large in practice still in their comfort zones. And I think what this whole effort, at least from my perspective, is to really move us where we're really uncomfortable, where we're working across disciplines in a much more transdisciplinary way. And to start thinking about how do we articulate the questions that really blend the social ecological connections of the natural resources, the environmental issues, and the livelihoods of people that we're trying to serve. And so I think as we start thinking about how we work together is to start reflecting on the questions that we have and actually start asking new questions. And asking, and to me it's a more looking at how do we actually blend the social science approaches in a way of understanding the issues, as well as then looking at the ecosystem approaches and climate approaches to provide some picture of some of the consequences in these natural resources in these climate dimensions. We're not there yet. I could, even from Rudy's discussions about the human dimensions of climate change effort, it's a really social science agenda. We see Betsy's presentation. A lot of it in Molly's work, it's really still conservation, ecosystem level stuff. We got to really move to the center and really start looking at that. And that's, I think, why we're all sort of interested in this type of network and working group. So we have a lot of expertise, but we need to figure out a mechanism and a platform to really start blending that expertise. And and so Shannon and I, in that capacity, will try to herd you all and ask you, if you're going too far on the conservation side or ecosystem side, coming back to how does that fit into livelihoods? What are the some of the connections? If you're working so much on the institutional governance, values, we're going to say, well, how is that connected to ecosystem services? Where is it that people are relating to the natural environment? So you're going to see us challenging you all as you feel uncomfortable. Ask questions that say, well, I don't understand what the hell you're talking about, the social ecological system. Because there's a lot of questions that and that's where the research side is really important. But then the application side, especially, how do we actually move this framework into an operational framework? And I think there's two kind of hats that we wear in this effort within the Climate Science Center. One is developing a research framework to actually get a better understanding of what we really mean and need to do. But then there's an application side where social dimensions and ecosystem and climate research comes into play, but in an operational way, an applications way, to how we really engage and give tools to managers to use them. So I think that's our challenge. There's duality in our challenge. We got to be clear on where we are in that dialogue. So those are my reflections on today, and I think hopefully we'll get further on that on Friday.
Yeah, thanks. That's a really great sort of reality check. And it dawned on me as Dennis was talking that maybe a way to break out this afternoon session is we've got multiple sort of steps of this process that we need to identify alongside of kind of the research questions, methodologies and that. So perhaps it makes sense to break it out into, process and research, and we can have groups that are working on those and maybe even rotate groups, because I think, we've got a lot of ground that we need to cover, and we're not going to do it all Friday. I think we're thinking of this as a continuing dialogue that people are popping in and out of. And so what's going to be the best process to keep that moving, given all of these really complex variables that we're talking about in terms of doing this kind of interdisciplinary, cross-agency, cross-sectoral, cross-governance scale type, systems regional approach. So how do we set ourselves up to be able to do that? And I think that's got to be a lot of what the conversation is on Friday. But in parallel, we need to be having those intellectual discussions where we're, making sure that we're creating a common lexicon to speak to each other, that we are understanding each other's paradigms and frames and methodologies and all of that. So I'm kind of thinking out loud here, but this is what I think, we need to really kind of use that afternoon to start setting ourselves up to be doing that. And so maybe that kind of a parallel process. And I welcome anybody. I mean, I know a lot of you, there's a lot of smart people in this room. There's a lot of smart people on the webinar. This isn't your first time at the rodeo. And so people have other processes and experience. Lisa through the recess. I can't tell you how many meetings and classes and lectures I've sat through trying to figure out a lot of this stuff, Dennis and all of you. So I welcome any sort of suggestions about how we do this, how we keep this moving, and how we move forward. So do you want to, okay, so I'll just repeat what you say, or do you want to come over here? Because the people on the computer aren't going to be able to hear you. Yeah, move to the mic.
Hi, everyone. This is Todd Sanford from ECS. I'm going to provide very much a sort of a novice outsider perspective, but one thing I've been hearing throughout the past day and a half is sort of the refrain of not reinventing the wheel. Mm-hmm. And as Dennis mentioned, it's kind of a challenge to merge the social side and the ecological side. And we were actually at a meeting in D.C. a few weeks ago. It was the National Academy Committee on Sustainability or something. And one interesting point is they were grappling with the same issue of how do you incorporate the social sciences into sort of what they call the physical biology side of things. And they pointed out the sort of the IPCC process that initially it started out as more of the physical scientists, and then there was a tension with the biological side of things. But at some point those two sort of merged naturally and became an entity. Now they're moving along to how do you move the social sciences into this physical biological entity. So someone pointed out that as you're determining how to make that merger, that it's useful perhaps to look at how the physicists and the biologists merged pretty seamlessly at that point. So looking for historical case studies that could be of use.
Yeah, and that's a great point. I appreciate that, because I think it at least in a sense, Dennis and I were kind of thinking of the IPCC model of how this working group might function and how this working group might interact with our other tracks of our science agenda for the Climate Science Center. So Jeff Morissette, I don't know if Jeff's still on the webinar or not, but he's going to set this up on Friday to really, and we didn't do it here more because of the focus of the conference in just a matter of time, but we do have these 3 science tracks. One is the more kind of fundamental climate science track. The second is the kind of ecosystem impacts and responses track. And then the third is this adaptation and decision-making track. So in a sense, those are and can operate like the working groups of the IPCC. And then within this group, we talked about that, you know, within our group, we've got a mix of social scientists, we've got ecologists, we've got some climate experts, we've got university people, we've got agency people across agencies. So even in this adaptation group, we've kind of got these concentric circles that could potentially be broken down into different working groups within our adaptation working group. So I think it's a really good point of how we might take lessons learned from the IPCC and also lessons about what didn't work for the IPCC, because as anybody in the room knows that's been involved in that, they've had a lot of struggles. And I'm not exactly sure how we do that. Yeah, exactly. So Lisa had a comment about that.
So this is Lisa Dilling, and just to comment, a little bit nervous organizing like the IPCC. Just based on, I mean, I'll just say that right out there, because you know we've been there, done that. You know, there's an opportunity with this Climate Science Center to do something maybe innovative and different, learning from what happened, the good things and the bad. You know, but that aside, forget that was sort of just a comment, editorial comment. The comment I wanted to say was, I really like the idea of organizing around problems or around something that we're trying to either figure out or solve as a problem out in society or something like that. And to me, that's how integration happens the best. Communities, biology and physics, the communities that have come together naturally, it's because they couldn't solve the science problem without coming together. If they didn't come together, they couldn't do their research or their work. Now we're in an even more expansive notion here because we're trying to also work not just on research but on practice. You know, we're trying to kind of have impact on the ground. I'm speaking for you guys. I don't. I'm assuming that's what you're doing. Yeah, I think. Yeah. But I think so that's another model, though. To me, that's a different model than organizing according to. I mean, the IPCC Working Group 1, it's the physical and natural sciences. Working Group 2, it's impacts. You know, basically it's impacts, looking at what the impacts are to be projected, and some on adaptation, and then Working Group 3 is more of the mitigation and, you know, it's sort of the actions in that area. And obviously it's evolving all the time too, what those groups really are. But you can see how they're just creating different stovepipes in a way. So we're going to all have to have stovepipes. You always have to have stovepipes. So maybe integrating around a problem that's of real salience to everyone, that would be get a lot of traction for a good pilot thing to do.
Yeah, that's a great point. And actually, in a sense, I think we are doing that. Jeff Morissette, are you still on the line? Because I think, and Dennis, you can chime in on this as well. I think as we're evolving, you know, we've got a solicitation out right now that we're going to fund 2 or 3, we're not really sure at this point, projects. We've got, the Climate Science Center also has some directed funding, and there's going to be multiple conversations over the next couple of months about between these 3, between the funded PIs and between the leads of our science tracks about how best to kind of set up the center and the funding. And I think those kinds of insights are really good because that might be a way that we can innovate in terms of setting up around projects and problems and issues as opposed to the more stovepiped working group setup. So Jeff, are you still on? Did you have any comments about that?
I am still on. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Great. But do have to sign off at 12. And you hit the nail on the head, and maybe just to add to it would be that the solicited work is meant to be a very specific land management decision that we'll use then to do that integration across those 3 areas. So we do have the solicited work that we'll be selecting, And then we'll have the 3 foundational science areas and a little bit of directed money, but definitely trying to use those solicited projects to serve as that integrative topic across those 3 areas. So it's a good introduction, and we'll talk more about it on Friday.
Yeah, and I think, Jeff and Dennis keep reminding me and everyone, we're not a bucket full of money. So the Climate Science Center, while it does have funds it solicits projects for, we're also looking for funding. So, there are some people in this room who have submitted proposals, and, in the back of my mind, I'm thinking, well, what about the people who don't actually get funded, and how do we keep them engaged? And I think, again, on Friday, we can talk about this, that, if those projects aren't chosen through the Climate Science Center, how can we work together to get writing more proposals collectively and getting funding, leveraging the resources we collectively have, leveraging our Climate Science Center resources, the LCC resources, and all of the, the agencies and universities and others that are part of this consortium. So, keep that in mind as we move forward, that, there are these different mechanisms for working together, and insofar as we can, we want input from you guys, how we can help support those efforts and leverage those efforts, whether or not they get, funded through the Climate Science Center, or we apply for funding to something else, whether it's NSF or NOAA or whatever it is. So, do you want to come over here, Molly? It's okay.
So this is Molly Cross from WCS, and just speaking as someone who's new to these discussions in this group, I think that, just partly an answer to your question right there, Shannon, is that for me, I come from a more ecological standpoint, but I've been starting to think about how to bring these in, but partly don't always know who are the experts that I could maybe connect with to bring some of those sort of non-ecological, socio-ecological perspectives. So just sort of getting that kind of network aspect of the network of practitioners that I know is part of your goal, I think I would just advocate as saying that's really valuable to me, and is one way that, again, outside of funding projects, that this community can really provide value. Well, I guess I'll just leave it at that.
Okay, thanks, Molly. Yeah, that's a great point, and again, that is one of our multiple objectives for the group and for the workshop. And I think just one more point I want to add is that to sort of place in our folder of things we need to think about is we've also got the really enormous challenge of bridging from the research community to the practitioner community. And it's been touched on several times throughout the morning, but I think that, that is no small endeavor. And so as we're thinking about how to get our ducks in a row as a research community, we also need to be thinking about how and when is it appropriate to engage the practitioners who are out there, who are in these agencies, and really don't have the luxury of coming to these meetings and getting really fully involved in the research, but are interested. So I'll end on that note. Did you have any other notes, Emma? Thank you all. This has been really, really great and informative, and I really look forward to continuing the dialogue with all of you. Thank you, everyone who joined remotely.